Chapter 1706. In the face of such a change, Luo Fan had already expected it. If he was just an avatar, he would naturally be powerless to resist in this situation. He could only allow the primordial epic spiritual treasure fragment to absorb all the energy and light in his body, causing him to fall into a state of exhaustion. However, it was clear that he wasn't an avatar. What was here was his true body. Therefore, at this time, he didn't reveal any uneasiness. His eyes revealed an expression that he had already expected this. With a thought, the fusion of the two spiritual lights in his body suddenly began to undergo some mysterious change. A completely different structure began to form within this fusion body. World after world, space-time after space-time, began to appear within this fusion body. Not long after, the fusion of the two spiritual lights had already turned into a group of countless worlds. Under this change, an eternal and inextinguishable aura began to leak out from the fusion of the two spiritual lights. Gradually, his body was filled with this eternal and inextinguishable light. From this appearance, it was clear that this fusion body had already transformed into a simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light. After this simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light, it naturally produced some kind of indescribable power. An indescribable pulling force acted on every world above the simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light. At this time, these worlds began to produce an indescribable resistance, causing them to produce a powerful resistance against all forces that wanted to separate them. In other words, at this time, the absorption of the primordial epic spiritual treasure fragment towards the simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light was suddenly offset by this powerful resistance. In the end, the simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light finally turned the impossible into the possible. At the last moment, it brazenly broke free from the absorption of the primordial epic spiritual treasure fragment. The simulated pre-celestial inextinguishable spirit light finally broke free, finally obtaining its rare freedom. The primordial epic spiritual treasure fragment began to wildly vibrate at this moment, and an indescribable attractive force was constantly emitted. It wanted to pull in all the forces around it, wanting to continue to supplement the arm seal. This would make the power of the arm seal even stronger, and it would be able to completely change this part of the world even faster. However, it was a pity that even though there was boundless power in the surroundings, it was not enough. But compared to Luo Fan's spirit light fusion, this power was far weaker. In other words, the current innate, inextinguishable spiritual light was still billions and billions of times inferior. In this sort of disparity, even if the primordial spirit treasure fragment pushed its suction power to the limit, it still wouldn't be able to absorb much strength, much less replenish that arm seal. Therefore, in the end, the primordial origin spiritual treasure fragment gradually fell into silence. The primordial essence spirit treasure fragment fell into a deep silence. Naturally, this caused the arm print to gradually stop. The circle of light around the arm print began to gradually dissipate, turning into specks of light fragments. It gradually disappeared into the void, becoming completely invisible. As the circle of light disappeared, the ripples that had been emanating from the circle of light that had changed the surrounding space and time naturally disappeared as well. The disappearance of the ripples caused the surrounding space to lose its impetus to change, and finally, it could not withstand the pressure from the outside world. It couldn't withstand the power of the outside world to restore its original state. In just a short while, he had completely collapsed. Everything returned to its original state. Only at this point did the arm seal gradually dissipate, completely turning into bits of energy that scattered in all directions, gradually disappearing into nothingness. By the time the arm mark disappeared, everything had returned to normal. If there was anything different from when Luo Fan first arrived, it would be the grayish existence that had appeared out of nowhere and sealed the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light and the good sovereign. Luo Fan stood there quietly for a while. Then he smiled and took a step forward, disappearing without a trace in the blink of an eye. Although this world was vast, for a third-grade monarch like Luo Fan, it was only a step for him to go anywhere. Soon, he had traversed through the endless void and returned to his palace. When he arrived here, he saw the ring-shaped, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light slightly expanding and contracting. It looked like some kind of creature was breathing in and out. Compared to when he left, this place hadn't changed at all. He couldn't tell that it was so heaven-defying that it almost blasted its master, Luo Fan, into a state of chaos. What's going on? Carefully sensing the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, Luo Fan couldn't help but fall into deep doubt. The innate, inextinguishable spiritual light seemed to have completely removed the imprint that belonged to him at this moment. In his senses, the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light was just an ordinary, inextinguishable spiritual light, and it even felt like someone else's inextinguishable spiritual light. He couldn't sense any communication with it at all. As for his clone, it had completely disappeared at this moment. At least, it had disappeared from his senses. Facing such a situation, how could he not feel puzzled? After thinking about it carefully, he let out a long sigh. I still don't know enough about the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. If I knew a little more, perhaps things wouldn't be like this now. With a sigh, he shook his head and sat down on his throne again. He closed his eyes and quietly controlled the simulated innate, inextinguishable spiritual light that he had condensed to resist the suction from the primal origin spiritual treasure fragment. He dispersed the world within it and allowed the simulated innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to return to its original form. He did his best to return to the original state where the two spiritual lights fused together. The simulated innate, inextinguishable spiritual light was powerful and had a high quality. But after all, it was an existence of some kind of divine ability. This kind of existence could be used to fight enemies, but if it was placed in one's body and treated as one's own power, it would clearly be a little inappropriate. Only this kind of fusion of spiritual lights was suitable for one's body and could support one's cultivation realm to step into that supreme level. To be able to fuse spiritual lights into this simulated, innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, it was naturally a simple matter. Soon, that kind of aura emanated from Luo Fan. The eternal and indestructible aura had completely dissipated. His body returned to its normal state. The space-time dimension that originally belonged to him and was different from all other space-time dimensions. It began to gradually appear around his body and even filled the palace in front of him. Of course, outside of the connate indestructible spirit light, it was also outside of the palace. The innate, inextinguishable spirit light was an existence of the true sage level. Its own space-time dimension was naturally the most stubborn and the most complete. Even if Luo Fan was already a true sage, it would still take him a lot of effort to affect it, not to mention that she was only a level 3 emperor. Following this change, the entire hall appeared to outsiders. It was as if he had disappeared, turning into a form that the other pseudo-saints could only vaguely see but not see clearly. An existence that they could not understand. In fact, this unique space-time dimension continued to spread in all directions with Luo Fan's cultivation. Gradually, unknowingly, it had already enveloped the entire holy mountain, causing it to also become blurry. This made others even more confused and unable to understand this holy mountain. And this, it did not affect the feelings of the people in the civilized country toward this holy mountain. On the contrary, because of this mysterious change, this holy mountain became even more mysterious and profound in their hearts. At this moment, Luo Fan had already forgotten everything that was happening in the outside world, such as the changes in the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, the changes in his clone that was cultivating inside, and so on. Everything had been thrown to the back of his mind. He had once again devoted all his attention to the process of completely integrating his worldview with his body. A mysterious light that belonged to Luo Fan, or rather, The light that belonged to his worldview began to slowly emit from his body. To him, everything in the outside world was secondary. What innate, inextinguishable spirit light! What clone! Compared to his own cultivation, compared to his own body, they were all secondary, since he could not figure out what exactly had happened and what changes had happened to the innate, inextinguishable spirit light. There was naturally no need to be entangled in it. As long as he carefully carried out his own cultivation and carefully improved himself, everything would not be out of his control. As for the others, they would naturally be the icing on the cake. If there were none, it would not harm him in any way. Just as Luo Fan's main body was in a state of cultivation in this hall, his clone had already brought Gui Shou and the others to a certain civilized country. "This is where my cave abode is," Gui Shou said to Luo Fan at this moment. Although Luo Fan had brought Gui Shou to this location, it was Gui Shou who had first explained the special features of this place before Luo Fan arrived. This special feature was none other than the fact that this was where Gui Shou's cave abode was located. Luo Fan glanced over and found that this civilized country was much worse than any other ordinary civilized country, let alone the most powerful and central civilized country where Luo Fan was. The entire civilized country was vast, covering a range of hundreds of light years, and the population was also calculated in the hundreds of trillions. It could be considered a middle-level civilized country among many countries. However, the level of development of the entire civilized country was extremely poor. It felt like this civilized country had just been established, and even the fate of the country was rather loose and not cohesive. Everywhere was in a wild and primitive state, and many places were even in chaos. Such a civilized country. It was actually where Gui Shou had set up his cave abode. This made Luo Fan a little curious. Out of curiosity, he began to thoroughly investigate this civilized country. He began to search for the secret of this civilized country. After all, Luo Fan was already a level 3 emperor. Even if it was just an ordinary clone that he had split out, its power had already reached an unimaginable height. It would have been fine if he hadn't thought of it, but once he thought of it, he wanted to thoroughly investigate it. There was almost nothing that could hide from him. Soon, he had already discovered the true secret of this place. It has actually developed to this step. It seems that this world is really about to start its final evolution. Luo Fan let out a long sigh. During the process of his main body's cultivation, his clone, Gui Shou, and the others traveled between various civilized countries, allowing Luo Fan to see the great changes that had taken place in this world over the past tens of millions of years. He also understood that this world had developed to a certain juncture that was about to transform, or rather, it had already developed to a certain boundary. And this point had been completely confirmed after he really saw the secret of this civilized country in front of him. "Master, please teach me. Although I already know that there is something extraordinary here, it's just a sudden inspiration." However, it was just a feeling of sudden inspiration. Even after living here for tens of millions of years, it was still a blurry feeling. It's hard to recognize it. Gui Shou was overjoyed at this time and quickly said. Hearing this, Luo Fan was slightly stunned, and then he laughed. Previously, Gui Shou seemed to have a card up his sleeve, and his behavior when he asked Luo Fan to come here did not seem like he was asking for advice at all. Instead, it seemed like he was showing off that he had chosen such a good place. Unexpectedly, it turned out that Gui Shou was also not confident about this. He wanted to guide him through Luo Fan's eyes. Humph! At this time, Qing Yi snorted disdainfully. He actually uses little tricks on Master. He really deserves to die. Master will definitely not let him go. It's best to suppress him for hundreds of millions of years. Yu Ji also echoed at this time and said, That's right, that's right. In this way, we will take care of this whole world on his behalf. In that case, this world will definitely develop better than it is now. Hearing this, Gui Shou became anxious and said, Don't slander me. How'd I use my little tricks on Master? I just didn't have time to ask Master for advice. You see, haven't I already asked for advice now? As for Luo Fan, Gue Shou did not dare to be negligent at all. Before he met Luo Fan again, he still had the thought that his strength had improved to this level. Perhaps he still could not compare to his master, but at least he should be able to wrestle with him and not lose too badly. However, after meeting Luo Fan again, he clearly found that compared to before, the gap between him and his master did not shrink at all. On the contrary, it had increased countless times. In the past, he could barely touch the edge of his master's strength, but now, in his eyes, Luo Fan was completely a bottomless pit. Under such circumstances, the self-confidence that he had built up before was naturally smashed to pieces. Humph. You still say you didn't use your little tricks? If you didn't, why didn't you ask for advice directly just now? Why did you wait until now to ask for advice? Qing, he still did not let it go. Hearing this, Gue Shou became even more anxious. When he was about to say something, Luo Fan had already interrupted him. All right, don't be entangled in this kind of small matter. What's more important now is this civilized country. Hearing this, Gue Shou heaved a sigh of relief, but Qing Yi and Yu Ji were somewhat unwilling. Although the two of them did not stay away from this world for more than 30 million years like Luo Fan, they put more of their energy into cultivation. Therefore, this time, they also followed Luo Fan around the world and saw with their own eyes what the world had become after more than 30 million years of development. They also truly felt the terrifying power and the indescribable power of transformation that had been condensed over the more than 30 million years of development. It was because of this that they naturally became more and more envious of Gue Shou's encounter. They naturally felt even more regretful that they had been defeated by Gue Shou in the past. Therefore, they naturally wanted to give Gue Shou a hard time as soon as they had the chance, so that Luo Fan could give them the authority to control all the civilized countries, so that they could also obtain the various conveniences that Gue Shou had obtained at this moment and obtain the blessing of the entire vast and boundless civilized country. Even more so, in their hearts, they had already begun to calculate to what extent they would improve if they obtained the blessing of the country. As for their thoughts, Luo Fan naturally saw through them. However, he only felt that it was funny and did not really take it to heart. In reality, in his eyes, although Gue Shou seemed to have obtained endless benefits and had a huge increase in cultivation realm compared to before, he did not really take it to heart. At this moment, there was an endless stream of the country's fortune pouring into his body and mind, causing his cultivation realm to constantly improve. In the end, he might even complete some sort of qualitative change and become a level 2 emperor and condensed spirit force. However, his encounter was not necessarily much better than Qing Yi and Yu Ji. After all, while enjoying the blessing of the country's fortune, Gue Shou also had to bear the responsibility of the countless civilized countries in the world. This would bind him to the entire civilized country. Even if he could no longer obtain benefits from the civilized country in the future, it would be difficult for him to leave this civilized country and obtain true freedom. This would bind him to the entire civilized country. Even if he could no longer obtain benefits from this civilized country in the future, it would be difficult for him to leave this civilized country and obtain true freedom. In comparison, Qing Yi and Yu Ji seemed to be much weaker and could not obtain any blessing of the country's fortune. However, they were still free and unfettered. This kind of freedom was enough for them to freely choose the kind of life they wanted, and it was enough for them to freely choose the cultivation method they wanted. In the future, the possibility of them reaching a supreme level was also greater than Gue Shou. In this way, comparing Gue Shou and Yu Ji, one was beneficial for the present and the other was beneficial for the future. As for which was better, it was up to the benevolent to the wise to see. This is a civilized country. It is the embryonic form of the underworld. Luo Fan directly revealed the true secret of this civilized country. Hearing this, Gue Shou, Qing Yi, and Yu Ji were all confused. Something like the underworld. They had never seen it before. Now that they heard this name out of nowhere, how could they know what it was? How could they understand what the underworld represented? Luo Fan had already expected their reactions. At this moment, he only smiled and explained in detail, the underworld is the dark side of the world. It is a crucial part of the cycle of life. It is the end of life and also the beginning of life. A world can still be complete without the underworld. However, if a world with a civilized country does not have the underworld, it will not be complete. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were still fine, but Gue Shou's eyes were already shining with an inexplicable light, as if he had understood something. Immediately after, his aura began to gradually leak out of his body and spread in all directions. No matter what, Gue Shou was a supreme emperor. His aura was vast, and it was needless to say. At this moment, when it leaked out like this, the surrounding space almost could not bear the impact. Under this aura, it began to tremble slightly. Indistinctly, inexplicable cracking sounds could be heard coming from the void. For a supreme emperor, the range of a few hundred light years was really not much different from a small pond. Not long after, Gue Shou's aura had already spread to every inch of the void of the entire civilized country. Naturally, the entire civilized country was wrapped in this aura. Although Gue Shou's aura was powerful, it was closely related to the fate of all the civilized countries in the entire world. Therefore, although the aura was so terrifying that even space and time could not bear it, when enveloped by it, even the weakest living beings in the civilized country did not feel uncomfortable because of the existence of this aura. On the contrary, being enveloped by this aura, all living beings felt as if they had returned to the embrace of their mother. An indescribable sense of safety and comfort surged up. This caused all living beings to unknowingly burst into tears at this moment. Luo Fan could not help but smile faintly as he sensed all this. "Oomph! You didn't even inform us before taking action. How despicable!" Greenwing grumbled at this moment. Chapter 1707. At this time, naturally, no one cared about what Qingyi said. Even Luo Fan, at this time, was more concerned about Gue Shou's actions. At this moment, the aura exuded from Gue Shou's body gradually merged with the space-time, gradually merging with the endless great path fragments and true divine mysteries that filled the space-time. Originally, even though he was a supreme emperor, his aura was extremely powerless against the grand Tao fragment and the mysteries of the true saint. Perhaps he could find a way to merge with them, or perhaps he could move them, but it was impossible for him to change them. However, at this time, the indescribable comprehension in his heart made his aura possess some kind of unimaginable power. This kind of power made his aura actually begin to change in an extremely subtle way, changing the countless great path fragments and the endless true divine mysteries. In his transformation, the countless great path fragments and true divine mysteries began to undergo some kind of indescribable combination. Under this combination, the space-time within a radius of hundreds of light years in this civilized country began to gradually change. It was as if an inexplicable pair of scissors suddenly appeared around this civilized country and began to attack the space, gradually separating this civilized country from the surrounding space-time. This caused the space-time within a radius of hundreds of light years in this civilized country to begin to form an indescribable gap with the outside world. The moment this gap was completely formed, the countless great path fragments within the entire civilized country began to rapidly condense. Similarly, countless true divine mysteries also began to rapidly condense along with the great path fragments, gradually attaching to the whole condensed body. With this change, the space-time within this civilized country began to produce all kinds of incredible changes. All kinds of peculiarities that were originally completely mixed together began to gradually form layers. As all the great path fragments disappeared, a scene that had never appeared in this perfect world appeared at this time. It was supported by the rules and principles. Pure space-time. Pure space-time without the great path fragments and true divine mysteries. And these rules and principles began to gradually change as the great path fragments and true divine mysteries continued to condense. Gradually, they combined and gradually formed a complete whole, forming an existence called the rules and principles layer. Then, under the rules and principles layer, an inexplicable barrier began to form. This kind of barrier was so wonderful that it was faintly discernible. With a seemingly illusory appearance, it gradually constructed the nothingness under the rules and principles layer into an existence that was extremely common in other worlds. Unknowingly, as this happened, the fusion of the great path fragments and the true saint mysteries seemed to be attracted by some powerful force. It began to gradually penetrate through the layer of space-time, the layer of rules and laws, the barrier of the netherworld, and finally completely entered the netherworld. After entering it, these great Tao fragments and true divine mysteries were like wanderers who had left home. Faintly, it displayed a completely different characteristic from the outside world. It displayed an effect that had never appeared before. They began to disperse. It began to reorganize itself. In the end, it gradually condensed into a long river. One was traceless and without beginning. He did not know how big it was or how strong it was, but it gave off the mysterious aura of a true sage. It contained an incomparably intense, eternal, indestructible light that could not be erased by 10,000 tribulations. The moment the river was formed, Gui Shou, who was not far from Luo Fan's clone, suddenly disappeared. When he reappeared, he was already above the river. His aura seemed to be exhaling and exhaling, communicating with the river in the most fundamental way. As they conversed, the river began to change. At the same time, Gui Shou also began to change. These two changes happened at the same time, and the effect was equally obvious and shocking. In this kind of change, Gui Shou's cultivation realm began to gradually increase. It was as if there were countless truths and mysteries constantly pouring into his body, constantly turning into a driving force for his cultivation realm to increase. At the same time, the change in the long river seemed to be an extremely terrifying force that was constantly combing the long river, causing it to become more and more gentle. It made all the mysteries, truths, and powers in the long river become smoother and smoother. In the end, when this kind of change reached a certain limit, the long river suddenly emitted countless threads. Countless rays of light directly penetrated the netherworld and poured into the layer of rules and laws. This kind of change was so sudden, but it was also so natural. It made people feel as if they had blinked their eyes. To others, the sudden blink of an eye was naturally abrupt. However, to those who blinked their eyes, it was extremely natural. It was so natural that they would not even feel that they had blinked their eyes. After these threads and these rays of light poured into the layer of rules and laws, the changes that occurred above the long river began to appear above the layer of rules and laws. Similarly, it was as if some kind of terrifying force had begun combing through the layer of rules and laws. Everything in this layer of rules and laws, Gui Zifeng, and all the rules and laws were undergoing some kind of subtle change due to the existence of other rules and laws. And the direction of the change was toward a more gentle, more natural, and more undetectable direction for heaven and earth. Although the most superficial changes were fundamentally determined by the great Tao within, what directly determined it was the layer of rules and laws. In other words, all changes in the layer of rules and laws would naturally reflect on the normal space-time. As a result, at this moment, under the changes in the layer of rules and laws, this seemingly newly formed civilized country also began to inexplicably adjust. Space-time, in this process, constantly expanded. From the original space-time of a few hundred light years, it changed to an indescribable size. In just a few breaths, it had expanded thousands of times, from hundreds of light years to hundreds of thousands of light years, millions of light years, and even tens of millions of light years. And this was still not the limit. In this change, the space-time was still constantly expanding, constantly improving, the endless energy that was originally mixed with the great Tao fragments and true divine mysteries, to the point that it was completely indistinguishable and impossible to extract, began to gradually decompose and change its nature, gradually turning into a kind of energy that had never appeared in this space-time before. A kind of energy that contained energy that would make any living creature feel cold all over when they inhaled it. However, it was incomparably comfortable and wonderful yuan qi. Under these two changes, the civilized country that originally covered the entire space-time became even more insignificant. Even all the living creatures and all the buildings in the civilized country also experienced some kind of extremely subtle adjustment during this process. Although this kind of adjustment was extremely subtle, after all, the adjustment took a long time, and the final change was, of course, also because of this adjustment, of course, became extremely big. The various buildings in the civilized country. In this process, they gradually transformed into an extremely strange style. It felt as if they had been eroded by countless years and were about to become rotten. They were about to completely collapse, and they even made people feel as if they were ruins from millions of years ago. But, in fact, these buildings were still extremely sturdy. They were even more sturdy than before. As for the living creatures inside, needless to say, they had also undergone tremendous changes. During this process, their bodies gradually turned into a completely different characteristic from before. They still had flesh and blood, and they still maintained their original appearance. However, this kind of flesh and blood had already unknowingly undergone a brand new change, which was to turn into energy and become illusory. Under this change, it was unknown how many living creatures in this civilized country had lost their forms at this time. Their bodies changed along with the nature of their bodies, directly changing into all kinds of strange states such as ox heads and horse faces, or various dog heads and human bodies, with green faces and fangs. All kinds of forms seemed so incredible and unimaginable. At a glance, it was like a group of demons dancing wildly. However, at this time, no matter how powerful the living creatures in this civilized country were, including those false saints, they did not notice this change. To them, at this moment, what really attracted their attention was the aura that filled the entire civilized country, or rather, the entire space-time. The aura that belonged to a turtle was incomparably powerful and shocking. It even had the characteristics of eternal indestructibility and indestructibility. To them, nothing else could attract their attention as much as this aura. To them, this aura was their foundation and the goal they pursued. Everything else, even the changes that happened to their own bodies, was secondary to them. They were all insignificant. It has begun. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his head and looked at the sky. Unknowingly, the silhouette of a book had appeared in the sky. This book was extremely huge, and it needed to be calculated in light years to clearly describe the size of this book. What is this? Qing Yi and Yuji looked up and saw this book, and they could not help but exclaim at the same time. They naturally knew about things like books. They had even seen countless magic treasures in the form of books. However, at this moment, the shadow of such a huge book had formed in the sky out of thin air. It was hard for them to imagine, and even more incomprehensible. This book was only in the process of brewing and had not fully taken shape yet. Therefore, the name on the book was still blurry and could not be seen clearly at all. In fact, they were not even sure if the book had a name or a cover. "This is the Book of Life and Death," Luo Fan said with a smile. Book of Life and Death. Qing Yi and Yu Ji were puzzled. As they had not experienced the world of reincarnation, they naturally did not know about something like the Book of Life and Death. This time, Luo Fan did not explain any further. He just smiled and watched the Book of Life and Death take shape. His heart skipped a beat, and he suddenly lowered his head to look down. With this look, a look of realization appeared on his face. He saw that under the cover of countless layers of thick layers, a huge writing brush was taking shape. The size of this writing brush was of the same level as the size of the Book of Life and Death above. That was the ratio of the two. It was just like the ratio of an ordinary book to a brush. At this level, it was easy to imagine how big it would be. Magistrate's brush. In that instant, such a thought flashed through his mind. The Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush were legendary treasures that could control the life and death of all living things in the netherworld. Now that they were gradually taking shape, it naturally meant that this space-time was gradually changing toward the direction of the netherworld. At this moment, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush both emanated an indescribable fluctuation. This fluctuation, first, it swept across the entire civilized country, scanning through every living being within it. Then, he directly revealed this space-time. It directly penetrated through the huge gap between this space-time and the outside space-time, heading towards the outside space-time. In the space-time of the outside world, it was unknown how many trillions of light years were between heaven and earth. If a normal cultivator wanted to step through such a vast space-time, it would take a long time. Who knows how many billions of years it would take to accomplish such a feat. But at this moment, the ripples emanating from the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush seemed to penetrate time itself. As if it had penetrated through space, it instantly swept through the entire space-time that was unknown how many trillions of light years were between heaven and earth. It directly swept past all the living beings within its range. At this moment, cold harumphs continuously sounded from all directions. Among these cold harumphs, some were voices that Luo Fan was familiar with, while some were unfamiliar to him. It actually alarmed those emperors. Luo Fan's heart stirred. He already understood what was going on. This is the natural evolution of the world. I hope fellow cultivators can forgive me. Luo Fan's heart stirred slightly as he spoke. His words directly penetrated the space-time, the chasm outside the space-time, and were transmitted into the vast space-time, being heard by the people who had snorted coldly. After he spoke, gazes were cast towards the space-time. In the blink of an eye, they penetrated the chasm of space-time and shone directly on everything within the space-time. At the same time, they also saw Luo Fan clearly. Fellow cultivator really doesn't want to relax for even a moment. I didn't expect you to make such a big move in such a short period of time. The World King's voice directly entered Luo Fan's ears. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, I don't believe that fellow cultivator can't see that this is clearly the natural evolution of the world. What do I do? After all, it was fellow cultivator who caused all of this. Can you be blamed for it? The World King just smiled. Hearing this, Luo Fan could only helplessly shake his head. Fellow cultivator is ambitious. You actually want to control the reincarnation of this world. At this moment, another voice entered Luo Fan's ears. This was the voice of another level 3 emperor who had grasped the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. He was also someone that Luo Fan had seen before. Or rather, the World King had already introduced him to Luo Fan once. He was a level 3 emperor in the small circle. Luo Fan looked up. His eyes pierced through space-time and shone directly at the source of the voice. In an instant, he saw the figure of an old man quietly sitting on a rocking chair. This was indeed the level 3 emperor that he had seen before. This is the requirement of the world to perfect itself. I didn't come here on purpose. What ambition? Luo Fan just smiled and said. Hearing this, the old man faintly smiled and said, It doesn't matter whether it is or not. I believe fellow cultivator should know the importance of the reincarnation of this world, right? Of course. Luo Fan already knew what the old man was thinking. He smiled and nodded. Since fellow cultivator says that you don't have ambition, I'm afraid it's not appropriate for you to occupy the underworld alone, the old man said. Although I don't have ambition, this is the choice of the world. I'm not that stupid to give up without a reason. Luo Fan just smiled and said faintly. There was even a hint of mockery in his voice. It was fine if the level 3 emperor wanted to join in, but it would be a joke if he wanted to join in with just a few words. It could even be said that he was almost fooling Luo Fan like a fool. As a level 3 emperor who had cultivated for billions of years, as a powerful existence that had grasped the true path to the true divine realm, Luo Fan's determination was naturally firm. He naturally had a firm grasp of his own interests. How could he make him give up the benefits that were already in his hands? That was obviously impossible. If we don't join in, I'm afraid the reincarnation of this world won't be complete, right? At this moment, another voice was heard. Luo Fan's eyes flashed, and he turned his head to look at the source of the voice. A familiar figure appeared in front of him. It was the same level 3 emperor that he had seen before. Then, level 3 emperors, level 2 emperors, and even ordinary emperors began to join in. Their figures appeared in front of Luo Fan one by one. In the blink of an eye, the surroundings around Luo Fan had become extremely lively. The composition of the reincarnation of this world was extremely important to any world. If they could participate in it, how much merit they could obtain and how much care they would receive from the world was secondary. More importantly, if they participated in it, they would be able to get closer to the foundation of the world. Thus, they would be able to obtain some insights that were difficult to obtain in the past. In the end, there was a great possibility that their cultivation realm would be improved. Regarding this point, any cultivator who could become a supreme emperor would be extremely clear about this. It was precisely because of this. At this moment, they sensed that this space-time was gradually evolving into the underworld of this world, forming a key link in the reincarnation of this world. All the emperors could not sit still among them. Even the realm emperor, who had always been very open-minded, was the same. At this moment, many emperors began to regret not creating living beings with connate Tao constitutions back then. If they had created a creature with a born Taoism aptitude, Luo Fan would not have been the one standing here now, but them. This work of constructing a key link in the reincarnation of this world no longer required the consent of others. Instead, it was others who needed their consent. Unfortunately, even if they were supreme emperors, even if they were level 3 emperors, regret was of no help to them. Therefore, at this time, they could only regret in their hearts. Yet, they still asked Luo Fan to participate in it. Fellow cultivators, what price do you plan to pay to participate? Luo Fan just smiled and said. These words, it caused the entire place to fall silent. 4 supreme emperors, apart from all existences related to true saints, everything else was meaningless to them. However, all existences related to true saints were incomparably precious. They could even be called the most precious existences in the lives of supreme emperors. How could they use them in exchange for the right to participate? Therefore, at this time, the place fell into silence. Everyone, please hurry up. This underworld is about to take shape. Once it takes shape, anyone who wants to enter this place without participating will be suppressed by the world, let alone gain any benefits from it. Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, if it had been someone else, facing so many level 3 emperors in front of them, an ordinary level 2 emperor would naturally be courting death by saying such a thing. Even a level 3 emperor could teach Luo Fan a lesson at any time. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan was not someone else. Previously, his main body had easily sealed a veteran level 3 emperor like Emperor Gu, causing Emperor Gu to only be able to sleep in the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light and even lose all perception of the outside world. However, this situation made all the emperors clearly understand how powerful Luo Fan was. They knew how difficult it was to provoke him. Under such circumstances, unless there was a fundamental conflict of interest, even a level 3 emperor would not dare to easily go against Luo Fan. Therefore, at this time, although they had the advantage in numbers, none of them dared to incite others to besiege Luo Fan. None of them dared to use force to do so. Although participating in the construction of the world reincarnation is quite useful to us, it does not require us to exchange for a true saint existence, the old man who spoke first said faintly. Upon hearing this, although the others didn't nod their heads, their gazes were filled with agreement. A true saint existence is naturally the most valuable to us. However, this does not mean that it is only valuable. Luo Fan just smiled and said. Chapter 1708. When Luo Fan heard this, he couldn't help but smile. This is just a material thing. To us, apart from material existences, there are also non-material things that are of great value. I believe all of you should be well aware of this. When the World Emperor heard this, a look of realization appeared on his face. Apart from the World Emperor, the other emperors also gradually revealed an indescribable look of realization. Very clearly, they all gradually understood Luo Fan's intentions. However, understanding was one thing, but it wasn't that easy for them to make up their minds. They still had to carefully consider whether this exchange was beneficial to them or not. However, they still had to carefully consider whether this exchange was beneficial to them or not. As a result, the scene fell into a state of silence. During this process, the changes in the underworld became more and more obvious. The various changes in the space-time caused the difference between this space-time and the outside world to become greater and greater. The nature of the countless living beings in this space-time had completely changed. It no longer seemed like the civilized country formed by the living beings with born Taoism aptitudes. Instead, it had become like the legendary hell of the underworld. Translator, Zephizi editor. Dioquin everywhere was eerie, and the world's origin energy that was extremely beneficial to spiritual bodies and spirits was everywhere. As time passed, the world's origin energy became denser and more obvious. In the end, it became visible to the naked eye. It appeared in the space-time and formed a fog-like existence, causing the entire space-time to become faintly discernible. The book of life and death that existed above and the judge's brush that existed deep underground also grew clearer and clearer. Faintly, they could already see the 3 words engraved on the cover of the book of life and death in some unimaginable language. He could also see the words judge's pen engraved on the judge's pen. This clearly meant that the book of life and death and the judge's brush were gradually taking form. Once the two took form, it meant that this space-time and the underworld before them had truly materialized and evolved completely. When the time came, if the other Supreme Emperors wanted to get involved, they would have to overthrow Luo Fan. They would have to overthrow Gue Shou, who was already above the Great Tao of space-time and had resonated with the Great Tao. That was an extremely terrible thing for all the martial emperors present, even if they were grade 3 martial emperors like the World Emperor. After all, Luo Fan's strength had been fully displayed before. Emperors like them, even if they were level 3 emperors, none of them had absolute confidence that they could defeat him. Even if all of them joined forces, they would still have to pay a huge price to do so. For this underworld, for this crucial part of the reincarnation cycle of this world, they would not pay such a great price. These monarchs could clearly see all the changes in the underworld. In their hearts, they unknowingly began to feel anxious. In the end, the World Emperor sighed. Since fellow Taoist is interested, then, how about I make a copy of my understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light and impart it to you? Hearing this, Luo Fan was overjoyed and said, "Thank you for your help, fellow Taoist." That was what he meant. Each connate inextinguishable spirit light was different, and each connate inextinguishable spirit light had its own unique characteristics. Each of them was different from any other connate inextinguishable spirit light. However, it was the connate inextinguishable spirit light after all. This essence made each connate inextinguishable spirit light have a certain commonality with other connate inextinguishable spirit lights. This commonality was the true foundation of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. And this foundation, this was what Luo Fan was pursuing. If he could obtain this foundation, then even if he could not become a true saint, he would be able to be extremely close to that realm, and he would be able to survive in the state of chaos for a short period of time. Therefore, from the beginning, he had already set his sights on the understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light that all the grade 3 martial emperors in front of him had. Hearing this, the other grade two martial emperors and ordinary supreme martial emperors who did not have the connate inextinguishable spirit light all had ugly expressions on their faces. What Luo Fan wanted was the understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. How could they have the connate inextinguishable spirit light? They did not even have the connate inextinguishable spirit light. So naturally, they did not have the understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Didn't this mean that they were not fated to enter the underworld? However, if all the martial emperors united before, they could still raise an objection and use the general situation to pressure Luo Fan and force Luo Fan to give up his authority. However, now that there were grade 3 martial emperors who had reached an agreement with Luo Fan, they no longer had any hope. This was because every time a grade 3 martial emperor agreed to Luo Fan's request, every time a grade 3 martial emperor gave their understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light to Luo Fan, then it was equivalent to Luo Fan's side having an additional grade 3 martial emperor. They had completed the deal and paid the price, so they would naturally maintain this order and make sure that the price they paid would not be in vain. In this way, of course, they would maintain the order of Luo Fan. Seeing this, a few martial emperors sighed and bowed to Luo Fan before their figures gradually dispersed. They had directly withdrawn from the struggle for the authority of the underworld. As these martial emperors withdrew, the other martial emperors' expressions became even more unsightly. The withdrawal of these martial emperors had once again weakened the strength of their side. This was certainly not good news for them. At this time, the World Emperor no longer cared about them. Since he had already made up his mind, there was naturally no need to hesitate anymore. His heart moved. From the depths of his memory, countless memories, countless information, and countless thoughts began to quickly condense into his hands. In just a few breaths of time, he had already formed a ball of gray mist between his hands, as though it was in a chaotic state. As soon as Luo Fan saw this object, he knew that this was a scene that completely simulated the connate inextinguishable spirit light that had constructed his body. What it contained was all the World Emperor's understanding of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. At least, it was also the majority of the understanding, although these understandings existed in the form of information and memories. After all, the mysteries contained within were too mysterious and too incredible. Therefore, after it was formed, it naturally affected the structure of the information. Naturally, it would change its appearance according to the various aspects, and that was how it formed this gray and hazy existence at this moment. The World Emperor glanced at this object, sighed, and sent it forward slightly. This object directly penetrated the void and directly arrived in front of Luo Fan, quietly suspending there. Seeing this, Luo Fan smiled slightly and thanked him. Then he casually took this grayish existence. As this grayish existence entered his hand, he sensed that there was an endless stream of information flowing out of it, quickly pouring into his mind. Very quickly, it blended into his memory. This information contained endless truths and mysteries. It involved many mysteries that were completely different from the connate inextinguishable spirit light that Luo Fan currently mastered, but they were fundamentally related to the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. These mysteries, compared to the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spirit light that Luo Fan comprehended, it was more than 10,000 times more. Even though Luo Fan's current mind had already reached an indescribable state. At this time, he actually felt an indescribable sense of fullness constantly coming from his mind. And at this time, the endless information, endless truths, and endless mysteries were still constantly pouring in, constantly merging into his mind, constantly increasing his sense of fullness. Luo Fan stood there quietly, with only an inexplicable expression on his face. There was endless light constantly flickering in his eyes. That light seemed to faintly form a grayish existence, which revealed a kind of eternal and inextinguishable aura. The inextinguishable aura was weak, but it really existed. At this moment, a doppelganger was separated from the World Emperor's body. With a single step, the doppelganger had already crossed the space-time, crossed the chasm, and directly entered the space-time, appearing not far from Luo Fan. After arriving here, his aura began to frantically soar, directly pouring into this space-time, brazenly creating all kinds of indescribable exchanges with the great Tao of this space-time. The way they swelled and shrank was as if they were constantly breathing in each other's aura, constantly breathing in each other's power. At this time, the great Tao of this space-time began to inexplicably change. In addition to the imprint that belonged to the Gui show, a kind of vague imprint began to appear. At the same time, some kind of mysterious truth began to break through the space and enter the heart of the World Emperor's clone, just like what was happening to the Gui show at this moment. Along with this change, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush that were gradually taking shape also began to gradually emit the aura that belonged to the World Emperor. Seeing this, the third grade Emperor Realm experts couldn't sit still. Immediately, two third-grade Emperor Realm experts directly said to Luo Fan, "I am also willing to use my own comprehension of the inextinguishable spiritual light in exchange for this authority." Naturally, Luo Fan happily agreed. As he agreed, the level 3 Emperors immediately took action. One by one, they began to extract their own comprehensions from the depths of their memories, condensing into two completely different forms of innate, inextinguishable spiritual light in front of them. Then, they each broke through the void and sent them in front of Luo Fan. Luo Fan didn't refuse any of them. He received the memories and sent the various comprehensions into his heart, constantly merging them into the depths of his memories. They began to interweave with his previous comprehensions, constantly rotating, constantly recombining, gradually producing all kinds of indescribable transformations, forming all kinds of incredible chemical reactions. Vaguely, there was an indescribable, vague, inextinguishable source. It appeared in his heart. After handing over the memories to Luo Fan, the third-grade Emperor Realm experts naturally didn't wait for Luo Fan to summon them. One by one, they took the initiative to split out clones and quickly entered this space-time, entering the evolving underworld before them, appearing not far from Luo Fan. After arriving here, they directly did the same thing as the previous World Emperor. They began to communicate their auras with the great Tao of the space-time and gradually branded their own imprints into this space-time, into the two powerful treasures that were naturally born between heaven and earth. The Book of Life and Death and the Judge's Brush, these two treasures. They were pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. However, there is a huge difference between them and ordinary pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures. The power of these pseudo-primordial origin spiritual treasures wasn't much different from real primordial origin spiritual treasures. The reason why they were called pseudo-origin spiritual treasures and not real primordial origin spiritual treasures was because they were confined to this space-time and couldn't leave this space-time. Not to mention leaving this side of the world. If they couldn't leave this space-time, they naturally couldn't continue to exist in the state of chaos. If they couldn't exist freely in the state of chaos, how could they be regarded as real primordial origin spiritual treasures? This, in essence, was similar to the difference between a false saint and a true saint. If there was a difference, it would be that the difference between a false saint and a true saint was greater than the difference between a pseudo-origin spiritual treasure and a real primordial origin spiritual treasure. Luo Fan stood there quietly, looking a little startled. In his eyes, the light shadows of the three innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights were colliding with each other. They were constantly fusing, constantly collapsing, and constantly reforming. The scene was simply like three innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights were fighting, displaying all kinds of indescribable divine abilities and power. Seeing that two more third-level emperors had joined in, the other emperors couldn't sit still anymore. Immediately, the emperors completed the transaction with Luo Fan, and the comprehension of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights poured into Luo Fan's heart. They constantly intertwined with the comprehension of the countless, innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights, colliding with each other and creating all kinds of sparks. All kinds of incredible changes occurred. When the last third-level emperor completed the transaction with him, he already felt that there was no longer any gap in his heart, but it was already filled with the endless truth and mystery, and even the operation of his mind seemed to be affected at this time. At this moment, all of a sudden, there was a flash of light, and he couldn't help but wear a faint smile on his face. He felt that there was another emperor who didn't need to enter this space-time. She had already integrated her imprint into this space-time in an extremely hidden way and integrated it into the two pseudo-origin spiritual treasures. According to normal circumstances, this person's behavior broke the rules. However, Luo Fan did not stop her. Instead, he smiled faintly and focused his attention back into his heart. He once again immersed himself in the endless principles and mysteries that belonged to the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light that had just emerged. The main reason why he let the Emperor go was, of course, because the Emperor didn't need to enter this space-time to do what the World Emperor and the others could do after entering the space-time. Another reason was that the Emperor, back then Luo Fan, had already handed over his position in this civilized country to her. In other words, at this moment, the one standing here should be her. But because Luo Fan's strength was too strong, she didn't even dare to appear in front of Luo Fan, let alone raise any objections. As a result, she couldn't stand here, and the current situation was the same as before Luo Fan handed over his position to her. In other words, Luo Fan felt a little guilty towards her. After letting her go, Luo Fan's entire mind was immersed in the endless truth and mystery. These countless truths and mysteries involved more than a dozen innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights. Among these innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights, every single one of them was vastly different from the others. It could even be said that they were worlds apart. Among them, there were even two innate, inextinguishable spiritual lights that were completely opposite of each other. Under such circumstances, it was naturally extremely difficult for him to integrate all the truths and mysteries of the inextinguishable spiritual lights and extract the common characteristics of all the inextinguishable spiritual lights. It was something that was close to impossible. Therefore, at this moment, he had fallen into an extremely chaotic state. Although there were endless principles continuously rotating and surging within his heart, he was unable to completely arrange them. He was unable to completely smooth out everything within them. He could only immerse his mind and do his best to sense the unique characteristics of every inextinguishable spiritual light and experience the various comprehensions and thoughts that the World Emperor and the others had towards his inextinguishable spiritual light. It was easy to imagine that this process would definitely be an extremely long one. While Luo Fan quietly floated there, Qing Yi and Yu Ji, on the other hand, looked extremely nervous. Because Luo Fan had a different relationship with them, they didn't really feel the terror of a level 3 emperor from Luo Fan. To them, Luo Fan was still Luo Fan, and his aura was still the same as before. While they were shocked, they also felt an indescribable sense of security. However, in contrast, the World Emperor and the others were completely different from Luo Fan. It should be known that the World Emperor and the others had nothing to do with Qing Yi and Yu Ji. To them, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were completely insignificant ants. Although they didn't have any ill intentions, they also didn't have any good intentions. Under such circumstances, their auras naturally wouldn't be restrained just because of the existence of the two of them. This kind of unrestrained aura was natural. It would let the two of them truly feel the huge gap between them and the World Emperor and the World Emperor. They felt the fear of appearing in front of a giant dragon as insignificant ants. It turns out that Master is actually so powerful. This thought appeared in their minds at this time. Their performance confirmed a fact. That was, only when they were enemies could they truly feel the strength of their companions. However, what they can do, maybe we can also do. Qing Yi thought at this time. With a thought, she passed her thoughts to Yuji through the spiritual connection that she had gradually established with Yuji over the past tens of millions of years. Yuji heard it. His eyes lit up, but then he fell into hesitation. Everything that had happened previously, they had seen it with their own eyes. Even a terrifying existence like a level 3 emperor had to pay a great price in order to participate and achieve this step. They had to pass their various understandings to their master. They didn't pay anything and just got involved. Would it be a little inappropriate? Her thoughts were also passed to Qing Yi through that inexplicable connection. Qing Yi also fell into hesitation when she heard it. However, she quickly made up her mind and said, "Master's thinking is meticulous. If he didn't want us to get involved, he would have definitely warned us before this. Now that he hasn't said anything, it must mean that we have the right to get involved." Her words were extremely willful, and it was obvious that she was trying to convince herself and Yuji. Hearing this, Yuji's eyes lit up. However, she was still a little hesitant. After such a long period of growth, she was no longer a living creature who knew nothing. In the end, Qing Yi's words made her finally make up her mind. Even if Master doesn't let us, he will at most punish us. If we miss this opportunity because we are afraid of that punishment, we will definitely regret it in the future. That's right. At most, we will just be punished. Something that even these level 3 emperors want must be extremely precious. If we can get it, it will be of great benefit to our future growth. We can't miss it no matter what. Yuji finally made up her mind. After making this decision, the two of them looked at each other with eager expressions on their faces. Immediately after, the aura from their bodies began to seep out and directly penetrated the void of time and space. It connected with the great way of emptiness and produced an inexplicable resonance between them. The moment this resonance was established, the two of them instantly lost all sense of the outside world. In a trance, they found that they seemed to have returned to the time before they were born, or rather, before they were enlightened by Luo Fan. That hazy state of confusion was extremely familiar to them, and they also felt an indescribable sense of comfort welling up in their hearts. Tears unknowingly flowed from their eyes before they were enlightened by Luo Fan. Although they had no intelligence and only had instincts, they could not even think properly. However, that was their most natural and complete state after all. In this state, the barrier between them and heaven and earth was the smallest, and they could receive the greatest blessing from heaven and earth. Chapter 1709. Qing Yi and Yu Ji's participation naturally couldn't be hidden from the World Emperor and the other third grade Emperor realm experts. At this moment, they all looked at Qing Yi and Yu Ji. However, just as they had expected, the third grade Emperor realm experts didn't care about them. After sweeping a glance at them, they quickly shifted their attention back to the fusion of their auras and the space-time Great Tao. However, Qing Yi and Yu Ji were completely unaware of this fact. Everything that happened in this space-time was being sensed by Gue Shou, who was undergoing an inexplicable transformation on the Great Tao. Whether it was the transaction between Luo Fan and the other third grade Emperor realm experts, or the fact that the third grade Emperor realm experts fused their auras into the Great Tao, the Book of Life and Death, and the Judge's Brush, he could clearly see it. He understood the consequences very well. He didn't understand such a change at first. He didn't understand why Luo Fan wanted the other third grade Emperor realm experts to participate in this. However, he was, after all, meticulous in his thinking and outstanding in his wisdom. With just a little thought, he had already understood Luo Fan's thoughts and intentions. The underworld wasn't just a civilized country like before. The underworld was related to all living beings in this world. This included all the subordinates of the emperors, the living beings protected by these emperors, and even the emperors themselves. Under such circumstances, if the underworld couldn't obtain the recognition of as many emperors as possible, then there would naturally be a lot of trouble afterward. In the end, the entire world might be thrown into chaos because of this, and the stability of this world that had been developed for tens of millions of years would be broken. As a result, it was obvious that it was better to let these third-grade Emperor realm experts participate in this matter to let these emperors who might be unhappy with the establishment of the underworld change their standpoint and become the force that stabilized the underworld. After thinking about this, Gue Shou's mood naturally calmed down. He even felt a surge of admiration for Luo Fan in his heart. In such a short time, he thought of such a method to stabilize the underworld, to make the underworld truly an indispensable part of this world. His wisdom was brilliant. It was really unimaginable. During this process, time slowly passed. Unknowingly, several days had passed. After a few days of evolution in the space-time, it had already expanded to a boundless area with a radius of an unknown number of trillions of light years. Apart from this area, this space-time was filled with the yin-chi that was extremely beneficial to spirits and souls. It was so dense that it completely covered the entire space-time, causing it to look hazy and turbid. Occasionally, the flow of yuan qi would cause all sorts of horrifying sounds to ring out from every corner of the space-time. Ordinary people couldn't help but feel goosebumps when they heard it. Meanwhile, the Book of Life and Death and the Underworld Judge's brush were evolving. However, it had already evolved to its limit. Both of them had become completely clear, turning into a book and a brush. This book and this pen had extremely mysterious characteristics. Although it was not glowing, it was still very clear under the cover of the misty yin chi. It was as if the misty yin chi was completely non-existent to the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush. It also seemed the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush completely projected their existences into the mind of the viewer, so the viewer didn't need to look through their eyes at all. Looking through their own eyes at this moment, in the unseen world, the transforming Gue Shou's body trembled, and an inexplicable spiritual light was emitted from his body. This spiritual light constantly swallowed and changed around his body. Faintly, millions of inexplicable forms condensed on this spiritual light. This spiritual light was none other than the spiritual light that was condensed from the power that was summoned from that inexplicable place. The formation of this spiritual light meant that the Gue Shou had already surpassed the limit of an ordinary emperor and stepped into the level of a second emperor. The standard of a second emperor was to be able to use this spiritual light. The moment he underwent this transformation, his body trembled slightly, and he was sent out by an inexplicable force from the unseen world, directly appearing in a normal space-time. However, he did not appear directly in a certain place, but in the middle of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush. At the same time, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush began to shrink rapidly, as if there was an indescribable attraction force in his hands, and they began to gradually sink into his hands. Not long after, the two pseudo-primordial origins spiritual treasures, which were billions of light years in size, had shrunk to the size of an ordinary book and an ordinary brush, and directly fell into his hands. The moment his hands came into contact with the brush and the book, an indescribable light suddenly emitted from the Gue Shou's body. This light was so bright that it was even like the sun, directly penetrating the endless yin chi in the entire space-time. It looked as if countless rays of light had directly penetrated the fog, shining on all creatures and all matter in this space-time. At this moment, there was an inexplicable feeling in the Gue Shou's heart. There seemed to be an incomparably grand and vast while communicating with him. In other words, some incomparably grand and vast was constantly pouring his thoughts and thoughts into his heart. In the process of the thoughts and thoughts constantly pouring in, he vaguely understood the operating principle of the underworld and also understood the effects of the underworld from now on. He also vaguely knew how the reincarnation of this world would operate. Under the control of an inexplicable impulse, the Gue Shou slowly flipped through the Book of Life and Death, and with the other hand holding the Judge's brush, he began to draw on the Book of Life and Death. Writing, as he drew and wrote, a mysterious power directly emanated from the Book of Life and Death and the Judge's brush, instantly sweeping through the entire space-time. This caused everything in this space-time to begin to undergo some kind of indescribable change. The incomparably vast space-time was divided into areas during this change. These areas began to constantly change according to the information he obtained from the will, gradually changing into areas with all kinds of indescribable functions. After a while, this space-time had already become completely different from before. At the same time, in the center of the civilized country, almost all the living beings were unknowingly given some kind of authority over this space-time. Unknowingly, they had been bestowed with some sort of space-time authority, and the appearance of all their equipment had changed. All of them were sent into the various areas between the heavens and the earth. When they were horrified, an inexplicable information emerged from the bottom of their hearts, allowing them to instantly understand the source of their changes and why they had appeared here. They also knew how to return to where they were. This kind of information completely calmed down their originally agitated and frightened moods. At this moment, the Gue Show muttered, "Time to move on to the next step." At this moment, he opened his mouth and let out a soft cry. As he let out this cry, an indescribable fluctuation emanated from his body. This fluctuation directly merged with the space-time, fusing with the laws of space-time, and fusing with the mysterious Great Tao. As this fluctuation merged with the space-time, the gap between this entire space-time and the outside space-time began to gradually disappear. However, the disappearance of the gap did not completely connect this space-time with the outside space-time. In fact, the disappearance of the gap caused this space-time to continuously expand. It was not the expansion of the size of this space-time, but the expansion of another level. The result of this expansion, it was that this space-time and the outside space-time overlapped more and more. As this overlapped, the two space-times gradually merged into one in the spatial dimension. The two, from two parallel space-times, gradually turned into two space-times that merged with each other. As this overlapped, the countless living beings in the outside space-time suddenly felt that their souls were suddenly connected with something indescribable. This connection gave them an inexplicable sense of security from the bottom of their hearts. This connection gave them an inexplicable sense of security from the bottom of their hearts. It was as if they had been rootless duckweed in the past, but now they had found a place to take root. This space-time expanded at an unparalleled speed. In just a few hours, it had already expanded from the state of occupying a corner of the world to a state where the entire world and the entire space-time in the outside world had completely merged and overlapped with each other. In other words, the space-time and all the living beings in the outside space-time had unknowingly established an inexplicable connection. This connection was none other than the inexplicable imprint that was placed on the bodies of the countless living beings in the outside world when the space-time was evolving and taking shape. And the result of this connection was that all living beings would be attracted by this space-time after they died. They would naturally cross the barrier of space-time and enter the space-time in front of them. They would join the operation of the underworld in front of them. And after some inexplicable change, they would return to the outside space-time. At this time, the World Emperor and the others had already woken up. Although they were not irreplaceable members of this space-time's evolution, they had, after all, imprinted their imprints on the Great Tao, the Book of Life and Death, and the Judge's Brush. Under such circumstances, all the changes that happened to this world, the Book of Life and Death, and the Judge's Brush were naturally within their senses. Therefore, they could clearly sense how this space-time was truly embedded in the reincarnation of this world, and how it truly became a crucial part of the reincarnation of this world. At this moment, every third great emperor seemed to be deep in thought. Countless thoughts had already appeared in their hearts, and endless principles and profundities appeared in their minds. The profundities that they had comprehended in the past, which they did not feel much about before, seemed to have become extremely clear and easy to understand at this moment. Along with this change, all of them no longer held any resentment towards Luo Fan for extorting them. Instead, they rejoiced. They rejoiced that they had agreed to Luo Fan's extortion. They had truly participated in it. After all, They had given their comprehension of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light to Luo Fan. But this did not cause them to lose anything. Their comprehension was still their comprehension. What they knew was still what they knew. Under such circumstances, giving Luo Fan something that he wouldn't lose, even if he handed it over to Luo Fan in exchange for a huge boost in his cultivation realm and an opportunity to comprehend more, was really worth it. This world was different from other worlds. Before Luo Fan's arrival, the weakest living being in this world was also a pseudo-saint-level living being. Although, it was just that their strength and physical body were at the same level and their intelligence was extremely far apart. They were still pseudo-saints after all. Their level had already surpassed the requirements of immortality. Such a world. It did not matter whether there was reincarnation or not. However, ever since Luo Fan's arrival, as he began to create more and more living beings, and as he enlightened Gue Shou and the others, even weaker living beings that could not live forever finally appeared in this world. The appearance of such living beings represented that this world had become more complete. It also meant that the reincarnation of the world had reached a point where it had to be established. Only by establishing the reincarnation of the world, only then could this world be considered to have truly embarked on the path of sustainable development. Only then could it escape the guidance of the will of the world and control its fate bit by bit. It was also because of this requirement that the world began to nurture the underworld. Just as the underworld truly merged with the outside world, an inexplicable suction force appeared in the entire world. Under this suction force, endless souls began to cross the space-time barrier. They continuously poured into space-time. The outside world was vast and boundless, and there were living beings in it. It almost exceeded the limit that numbers could describe. Under such circumstances, the number of living beings dying at every moment was naturally innumerable. In just a few short breaths, the state of this civilized country that originally only had living beings in the center had undergone an earth-shattering change. In the areas that were separated by Gue Shou, a large number of souls began to appear, causing the space to become more and more lively. All sorts of strange sounds began to come from all directions towards where Gue Shou was. At this moment, Gue Shou was still drawing on the book of life and death with the judge's brush. The suction force that was born from space-time penetrated the space-time barrier and acted on the living beings in the outside world also became stronger and more obvious. At first, only the souls of the living beings who had not obtained immortality, which were souls outside of their life source, were drawn into this space-time after they died. However, as Gue Shou continued to draw, even the souls of the cultivators who had obtained immortality began to be drawn into this space-time after they died. This caused the number of living beings in this space-time to skyrocket once again. Moreover, among the newly added living beings, apart from those with natural Tao aptitudes, there were also many other strange living beings that were naturally born from the world itself. Seeing this scene, the eyes of the third-level emperors like the World Emperor revealed an inexplicable look of understanding. In the past, when the living beings in this world died, they would completely melt into the surrounding void. Even their flesh and blood might not exist, let alone their souls and souls. In the past, they didn't see anything wrong with this. However, after seeing the scene after the transformation, they finally realized that the transformation before their eyes was the true perfect state. The souls of those living beings didn't dissipate after they died. Instead, they entered the reincarnation cycle and began to grow and strengthen along with the reincarnation cycle. In the end, after countless years and countless reincarnations, they broke through the boundaries and became existences that far surpassed the state they were born in. This was the fundamental way of evolution of the world. For a moment, every third-level emperor had an inexplicable look of joy and excitement on their faces. For them, who still couldn't surpass the world, the higher the world grew, the more beneficial it would be for them. While they were constantly rejoicing over the changes of the world, Luo Fan had already gradually awakened from the mysteries of the countless natural, inextinguishable divine light. At this moment, the dozen or so natural, inextinguishable divine light had completely merged in his mind. All the mysteries were intertwined and turned into a state that was difficult to separate. The mysteries that originally belonged to the other natural, inextinguishable divine light had become different at this moment. At this moment, it had already become blurry. At first glance, it was already difficult to distinguish it. Compared to before, it was clear that he had made great progress. However, this progress still didn't meet Luo Fan's requirements. He still hadn't truly extracted the natural, inextinguishable divine light source of natural, inextinguishable divine light. What a pity. My understanding of the natural, inextinguishable divine light is still limited. Whether it's mine or theirs, Luo Fan sighed inwardly and pulled his attention out of the depths of his mind. As he pulled his attention out, endless information from this space-time and this world began to pour into his mind. In the blink of an eye, he grasped the changes of this space-time and the entire process of the reincarnation cycle of the world. It can be considered barely established. Luo Fan thought to himself with a smile when he saw that this was the way space changed. Now, the underworld was no longer in its original embryonic form. It had already become the real underworld. Those souls that entered the underworld would obtain a body that was completely compatible with the underworld under the effect of the great Tao of the underworld and would continue to live in the underworld. This survival time, it will be decided by the strength of their spirit souls. When their damaged souls recovered, they would die in the underworld, and their souls will be able to reincarnate into the outside world. A new round of life, or rather, a new round of reincarnation. This could be considered as establishing the key point of the entire samsara. As for why it was barely established, the reason was even simpler. Because of the establishment of such reincarnation. However, he only thought about how to circulate his spirit and didn't think about anything more specific. According to the differences in the spirit souls and their behavior in the outside world, the way they were treated would change. This would result in a single outcome. It would be impossible to change the direction of reincarnation in this world. If this cycle continued, the spirits that were harmful to the world and the spirits that were beneficial to the world would be strengthened and evolve. This would cause the world to become more and more chaotic as time passed. In the end, it might even cause the entire world to collapse. However, that was a matter for the future. At this moment, the underworld had taken shape, and it was many times better than before. This change gradually stabilized as time passed. After a few days, when the last trace of change disappeared and the entire underworld became eternally motionless, the Realm King let out a long sigh and said, "I have gained quite a lot this time, but I need to go into seclusion for a while. Goodbye." Hearing the Realm King's words, Luo Fan smiled and said, "Congratulations on gaining enlightenment, fellow Taoist." The Realm King suddenly laughed and said, "Fellow Taoist, you truly have a good plan. We have sacrificed so much, but in the end, we still have to thank you." "How scheming." Luo Fan couldn't help but smile and said, "Sacrificed so much? Fellow Taoist, don't lie through your teeth. What loss is there for you to copy that enlightenment for me? Not to mention, those comprehensions are just references to me. They don't have any substantial benefits." The Realm King only smiled and said, "Even if it's just a reference, it's still extremely rare. After all, this is the comprehension of an innate, indestructible spirit light." As he spoke, he cupped his hands at Luo Fan and bid farewell. His figure turned into a ray of light, and with a slight dash, he had already left the underworld and returned to the normal space-time in the outside world. This time, because he had obtained sufficient authority in the underworld and the underworld had perfectly fused with the entire space-time, he didn't need to do so. Therefore, he didn't need to travel through the boundless space-time to reach his cave abode. Instead, he directly returned to his cave abode from the underworld with a jolt. He didn't need to travel through any space-time at all. After the Realm King left, the other three emperors woke up one after another. They smiled and greeted Luo Fan. They expressed their gratitude and broke through the barrier between the underworld and the normal space-time to return to their cave abodes. Chapter 17:10. This underworld is not perfect yet. You still need to think about how to adjust it to make it perfect, Luo Fan said calmly to Guei Shou. Hearing this, Guei Shou was slightly shocked, and there was even a hint of surprise in his eyes. Obviously, Luo Fan's words were beyond his expectations. To him, the underworld was almost perfect. He couldn't even find anything that could be perfected. However, he didn't expect his master to say that the underworld before him wasn't perfect and that there were still areas that needed to be modified. Please guide me, master. Guei Shou was surprised. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled and said, "You need to think about it yourself to know. If I guide you, you could do it well now. But as time passes, when the results of this change become bigger and bigger, it will become more and more difficult for you to control this underworld. In the end, you may even completely lose the authority of the underworld. You haven't forgotten that you're not the only one who has authority in this underworld now, right?" Hearing this, Guei Shou couldn't help but shiver. He already understood Luo Fan's intention. Now, almost every level 3 emperor had various kinds of authority in this underworld. Moreover, although this kind of authority couldn't compare to Guei Shou's overall authority, it wasn't much worse than his in terms of depth. The reason why Guei Shou could control the underworld better than all of them and make all kinds of changes to it was because the entire underworld was completely evolved according to his body and mind. Although it wasn't a complete template based on his body and mind, it had some indescribable commonality with his body and mind. It was because of this commonality that the entire underworld treated him completely differently from other emperors. This allowed him to completely control the entire underworld and change it as he pleased. If this commonality was broken, then the situation would obviously change. Those level 3 emperors might have left decisively at this time, but that was because Luo Fan was here, and it was also because this was the choice of heaven and earth. If Guei Shou made any mistakes, they would absolutely not be courteous to him. They would definitely seize the underworld earth and take it for themselves at the first possible moment. They would directly remove Guei Shou's authority, obviously destroying the commonality between himself and the underworld. This was an oversight. It was very difficult to establish such a commonality, but it was extremely easy to destroy it. As long as the changes in the underworld earth surpassed the changes in the turtle's body and mind, it would be enough to destroy this commonality. In other words, if Luo Fan instructed Guei Shou to change the underworld earth would have some changes that he didn't fully understand, which were changes beyond his body and mind. This would naturally destroy the similarity between the underworld earth and his body. Thank you for your guidance, master. I understand now. The Guei Shou bowed to Luo Fan and said. Hearing this, Luo Fan just smiled. Then, he turned around and looked at Qing, Yi, and Yuji. Qing, Yi, and Yuji were listening to Luo Fan lecturing Guei Shou with great interest. Suddenly, Luo Fan's gaze turned to them, and they could not help but reveal surprise in their eyes. However, it would not take long. They had already realized why Luo Fan was looking at them. He couldn't help but blush. What about you? How many benefits did you get from the underworld? Luo Fan asked calmly. This is not considered much. Greenwing's voice was a little intermittent. Not much. Now, I'm only a step away from becoming an emperor. Isn't that a lot? Luo Fan said expressionlessly. If you look at it this way, it's indeed quite a lot. Yuji replied. You too. If it wasn't for them giving me face, the two of you would have been crushed by them. Luo Fan sighed and said, How is that possible? Qing Yi and Yuji's expressions changed slightly. Previously, they had consciously avoided the World Emperor and the other level 3 emperors. They didn't even want to touch their auras at all. Moreover, they were within the range of Luo Fan's power. How could the other third-rank monarchs possibly harm them? This was also the fundamental reason why they dared to participate in the matter of controlling the underworld. However, now that they heard Luo Fan say that it was very likely that they had taken a trip to the gates of hell, how could they not be shocked? Do you think you'll be fine under the protection of my power? If they want to deal with you, they only need to glance at you. They can directly trigger the power within your bodies and make you explode and turn you into dust. Even with the protection of my power, you won't be able to defend yourself against their gaze unless I carefully protect you during the process, Luo Fan said calmly. Qing Yi and Yu Ji couldn't help but break out in a cold sweat when they heard this. It's really dangerous. This thought surfaced in their minds in the blink of an eye. Since you've taken such a big risk and obtained so many benefits, don't waste it. What you need to do next is to cultivate in seclusion and convert all your gains into cultivation so that you can finally become a supreme monarch, Luo Fan said calmly when he saw that they understood the danger that they had faced. Only after understanding the danger did they learn to be respectful so that they wouldn't make the same mistake the next time they encountered the same situation. Moreover, only after understanding the danger that they had faced could they truly value the gains that they had gained. Only then would they work harder to unearth the principles and mysteries contained within, which would allow them to make greater progress in the end. Qing Yi and Yu Ji hurriedly nodded when they heard Luo Fan's words. This was how things worked in the world. The same thing felt completely different when it was obtained easily and when it was obtained painstakingly. If it was obtained easily, one might easily throw it away, but if it was obtained through painstakingly, one would make use of it no matter what. It was as if one's hard work would have been in vain if one did not make use of it. Qing Yi and Yu Ji were like that now. If Luo Fan hadn't mentioned the danger earlier, perhaps they wouldn't have let go of their gains in the underworld. They wouldn't have not worked hard to absorb the various gains and convert them into their own cultivation realm. However, their strength would definitely be much weaker than their current determination. This was the only time, after being threatened by Luo Fan, they finally made up their minds to convert even the slightest gain into cultivation. They wouldn't miss out on any principles or mysteries, seeing that they had made up their minds. Luo Fan smiled and said, "You too can cultivate in the underworld. The gains that you've obtained in the underworld are naturally more effective. It's naturally more effective to absorb them in the underworld." Qing Yi and Yu Ji hurriedly bowed to thank Luo Fan. Luo Fan waved his hand, and they naturally left. "What about you? Aren't you going to think?" After Qing Yi and Yu Ji left, Luo Fan saw that Gue Shou was still there. He frowned and said, when Gue Shou heard that, he seemed to have woken up from a dream. He hurriedly bowed to Luo Fan and left. He turned around and returned to his cave abode in this space-time. His cave abode was originally in this civilized country. Now that this civilized country had expanded into a boundless space-time, it had become a space-time that perfectly blended with the outside world. This cave abode naturally underwent an inexplicable change and became completely different from before. Now, it had transformed into a completely new form. This cave abode Gue Shou was originally like the place where Luo Fan resided in this space-time. It was just a hall that was opened up. However, as this entire space-time turned into the underworld, the hall in this cave abode also underwent an earth-shattering change. Although it still looked like a hall, however, it was no longer just a hall like before. Instead, it had transformed into an endless group of palaces. The hall that he originally resided in had become the most majestic and magnificent hall in the center of this group of palaces. Apart from the palace that was his residence, the other palaces were all different in style. All of them looked extraordinary and extraordinary. Vaguely, different auras could be seen coming from each of the palaces. Moreover, the nomological laws in each palace seemed to be inexplicably different. There seemed to be an inexplicable connection between the space-time of the underworld and the outside world. There was also an indescribable difference. Gue Shou's eyes lit up when he saw this situation. Although he already knew that his cave abode would change with the change of space-time, he did not expect the cave abode to change to this state. There was almost no trace of the original cave abode here. The entire cave abode seemed to have become the control center of the entire underworld. And the changes of the nomological laws were more like the sublimation of all the nomological laws in the entire underworld. Perhaps after I understand all the changes in this cave abode, I will know how to perfect the entire underworld. Such a thought flashed through Gu Shou's mind. The nomological laws of this cave abode were clearly much more complicated than the nomological laws of the underworld outside. The appearance of such complicated nomological laws here naturally could not just show how extraordinary and incredible the underworld was. Since it appeared here, it must represent a certain property of the underworld. And the more one understood the various properties of the underworld, the more likely it was to understand the imperfections of the underworld. Of course, it was also more likely that one could push the underworld in a more perfect direction. After understanding this, Gu Shou did not hesitate to enter the various halls in this cave abode. He began to ponder during the process, constantly comprehending the functions of the halls. In this process, time slowly passed. Just as Gu Shou was constantly comprehending the changes of the many halls in his cave abode, Luo Fan's clone had already landed on the land of the underworld. He began to casually walk on it and comprehend. This underworld was a newly opened space-time, and it was a kind of key to the reincarnation of this entire world. In such a situation, the netherworld Earth naturally contained the endless mysteries of this world. It naturally contained the foundation of this world. This was obviously very attractive to Luo Fan. Luo Fan didn't want the authority of the underworld. After all, it was true that obtaining the authority over the underworld would allow one to obtain more profound mysteries of the world and comprehend more of the principles of reincarnation. However, this would also cause his connection with the heavens and the earth to become deeper and deeper, making it more and more difficult for him to separate himself from the heavens and the earth. For those who wholeheartedly wanted to transcend this world. For Luo Fan, who had become a true sage, this was obviously not a good thing, especially since he still has. There were a few connate, inextinguishable spirit lights that he could comprehend, but he didn't need to enter the underworld earth. He didn't need to obtain the authority of the underworld earth to increase his cultivation. It was also because he didn't have the authority of the underworld earth that he needed to use this method to sense the underworld earth. Comprehending the underworld earth, if he had the authority, naturally there was no need to say anything. With just a thought, the various mysteries of the underworld earth would naturally pour into his memory. The underworld earth was filled with the mist-like Yin energy. For ordinary living beings, it was an impenetrable barrier. However, this kind of Yin energy was not a problem for Luo Fan at all. With a glance, he could already see through the fog and see everything he wanted to see. It was no different from normal space-time, of course. This was actually not his exclusive right. As long as one's cultivation reached a certain level, one would naturally be able to obtain this ability. Walking on the underworld earth gave him an indescribable feeling. In a trance, his life source seemed to be inexplicably nourished. It was as if there was an inexplicable aura surging into his body and surrounding his life source. It was as if it was constantly comforting and nourishing his life source. Even I can feel the effects of this Yin Qi. Those who have already lost their bodies. In fact, living beings who have lost their souls will feel it even more. Luo Fan thought to himself. He thought. His expression became a little strange. He raised his hand and gently made a grabbing motion. Within the Yin Qi, threads appeared in his hand. These lines were extremely mysterious. Even though they were in his hands, they were still frantically struggling to break free from his control. He returned to the surrounding fog. With a slight thought, his eyes carried an incomparably powerful piercing ability, drilling straight into the threads. The profound mysteries of the thread appeared in his mind as he moved. So that's how it is. It's actually a profound mystery of forgetting. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The threads themselves were not solid. However, it was formed by the condensation of information. This kind of information was not complete, but it could continue to accumulate and strengthen, finally turning into a powerful, profound mystery. The profound mystery of forgetting. In other words, as long as one lived in the underworld for a certain period of time, the accumulated effect of these threads would transform into an indescribable power. It would directly release a terrifying effect, directly wiping away the memories of the spirit that endured this power, turning those souls into a blank slate. It was obvious that the surrounding Inchi was the soup of forgetting in the underworld. In this case, the stronger the spirit, the longer it can survive in the underworld. The weaker the spirit, the faster it can leave the underworld, Luo Fan thought to himself. The stronger the spirit, the greater its ability to endure these profound mysteries of the past. The more information accumulated, the more it needed to completely turn the spirit into a blank slate. This also meant that it needed to survive in the underworld for a long time in order to accumulate enough profound mysteries. Correspondingly, the weaker the spirit, the less it could endure these profound mysteries of forgetting. Naturally, the time it could accumulate these profound mysteries would also be shorter. In this case, the time it could survive in the underworld would naturally be shorter. After understanding this, Luo Fan could not help but sigh to himself. Although this method is a little ingenious, it is still not difficult to bypass it. With a slight thought, he let go of the thread in his hand. Immediately after, he raised his hand and gently waved it, forming an air barrier around him. This air barrier could only wrap around his body, isolating him from the surrounding fog. The moment this air barrier was formed, the surrounding fog started to attack it slightly. It looked like this was a vacuum, and the surrounding fog was constantly surging in due to its own pressure. At this moment, some air slowly seeped out of the air barrier and continuously filled the surroundings of Luo Fan's body. Not long after, the interior of the air barrier was filled with a grayish fog. It looked no different from the outside world, be it in terms of density or color. The airflow inside the energy shield became the same as the airflow outside the energy shield. When it seemed like there was no difference, the fog that was constantly surging in naturally stopped. As the surroundings returned to their previous calm state, it seemed like there was no difference from the beginning. Under the shroud of the fog inside the air barrier, Luo Fan felt more comfortable than before. His origin of life was nourished even more meticulously, and it felt much better than before. More importantly, he could no longer feel the threads in the surrounding fog that he had previously grasped. In other words, this fog had lost its original effect of accumulating and turning into the profound mysteries of forgetting. As expected, as long as one has the strength of an immortal, one can isolate this profound mysteries of forgetting. He sighed inwardly. With Luo Fan's strength, it was naturally extremely easy for him to isolate those threads. In fact, he did not even need to isolate them. If he allowed the information to accumulate in his body, it would probably take hundreds of millions of trillions of years to accumulate enough profound mysteries to make him forget his memories. He might not even have the ability to make himself forget. The reason why he wanted to set up this air barrier to achieve the effect of filtering those threads was very simple. He wanted to see how much power he needed to use to filter out these threads. Just now, the power he used to set up the air barrier was clearly not all of his power. It was only an extremely insignificant trace of power. It was roughly equivalent to the power of an itinerant immortal. Moreover, the way the air barrier was constructed, it was only constructed according to the construction method that an itinerant immortal cultivator might have mastered. Under such circumstances, the air barrier could still filter out those threads and the information. This clearly meant that as long as one was an itinerant immortal cultivator, they would have the ability to filter out this information. This was to avoid living in the underworld for too long and causing their memories to disappear. In fact, there was even a possibility that they would be able to reincarnate with their memories intact. Perhaps no one had discovered this yet, but as time passed, more and more creatures would reincarnate through the underworld, and more cultivators would die and enter the underworld. This situation would inevitably be discovered. In the end, this air barrier, or a similar method to construct a defensive filter layer, would inevitably be created. At that time, the underworld would become the back garden of cultivators, a place where they could enter and leave as they pleased. The fairness of the reincarnation cycle would be completely destroyed. As a result, The world would develop in a direction that Luo Fan did not want to see. I hope that Guei Shou can discover this as soon as possible. Luo Fan sighed slightly as such a thought flashed through his mind. With this thought, he casually dispersed the air barrier in front of him. With a mere thought, his body became completely leakless. Nothing, no information, no vital energy, no power could enter his body and could no longer affect his life force essence. As this happened to his body, the comforting and nourishing feeling that the origin of his life had since vanished in an instant. When this feeling completely disappeared, the underworld in front of him had already become an ordinary space-time, an ordinary world. With a slight thought, Luo Fan took a step forward and arrived in the underworld. This world naturally evolved into a strange natural landscape. Every natural landscape here had its own characteristics. For example, some could remove something from the soul. Some could make the soul feel a certain degree of pain. Some could make the soul experience a certain change, and so on. There are all sorts of strange things. Chapter 17:11. While Luo Fan was walking in the underworld, several Supreme Emperors were discussing somewhere in the outside world. This location was an independent space-time. It was actually the abode of one of these Supreme Emperors. The entire space-time was vast and boundless, and it was densely covered with countless runes. These runes were none other than the condensation of the Great Path fragments. These grand Tao fragments have been constructed into countless talisman markings according to some sort of extremely profound and unbelievable method. These runes formed an inexplicable whole, forming a powerful defensive method that completely cut off the connection between this space-time and the outside world. Using various methods to cut off the connection between one's abode and the outside world was a natural method for all the Supreme Emperors in this world. However, compared to the abode of the other emperors, this space-time isolation method was the most powerful. Its isolation effect was also the most obvious. Through this defensive method, the connection between the space-time and the outside world had been completely cut off, and even the inexplicable connection had become faintly discernible. The Supreme Emperors here were all the Supreme Emperors that Luo Fan was familiar with. Among them were Emperor Ming, Emperor Wan, and Emperor Zi. There were more than 20 of them. This space-time looked like a flat land, with undulating terrain and countless living creatures. The void was filled with endless Great Path fragments and true divine mysteries. Everything seemed to be a replica of the space-time of the outside world. At this moment, Emperor Guan and the others were gathered on a tall mountain in the center of the space-time. This was a tall mountain. It towered into the clouds. At a glance, there was a boundless sea of clouds. Through this sea of clouds, everything in the space-time was directly imprinted in their eyes. Emperor Guan said, "I think you should know what the situation is now, right?" Hearing this, the other emperors showed inexplicable helplessness at this moment. This time, the establishment of the underworld. This is a sign that Emperor Luo is transforming the entire world. Once he completes the transformation of the entire world, we, the sovereigns who have offended him before, will no longer have any possibility of transcending. The Violet Emperor also sighed at this moment. Both of them. He wasn't the strongest among all the emperors, but the space before them was created by the two of them. Therefore, they naturally had more rights to speak. In fact, he was just like a host. The underworld is being guarded by practically all the rank 3 monarchs. What can we do? One of the monarchs said, "What do you think?" Even if he didn't know, he had to think of something. Could it be, fellow Taoists, could it be that you would rather resign yourselves to death? The Violet Sovereign said indifferently, "Fellow Taoist Ming Wang, it seems like one of your clones is being controlled by the Luo Sovereign." One of the emperors suddenly said to Emperor Ming and the others. His words instantly caused the atmosphere in the space-time to become tense. That Supreme Emperor's words were filled with the smell of gunpowder. It was clear that the Luo Sovereign and the others had ulterior motives. Perhaps they were involved in this matter and were even under the Luo Sovereign's control. They were specifically here to gather information. This was the strongest accusation at this moment. How could the atmosphere remain the same? Hearing this, Emperor Ming laughed coldly and said, "Fellow Taoist, could it be that you are absolutely certain that we are spies? I think that fellow Taoist has to admit that this possibility exists. The clones refined by the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light can affect your true bodies at any time. I don't think that fellow Taoists can completely break free from this influence and truly betray the Luo sovereign." That Emperor Ming said indifferently. Hearing this, the expressions of Emperor Ming and the others changed slightly. These words reminded them of their own experiences in the past. They remembered how Luo Fan had used these methods to deal with them. Although the clones are being controlled, with our abilities, we have already found a way to cut off this connection. Otherwise, why hasn't the Luo sovereign appeared yet? Since he hasn't appeared yet, that is already the best proof that we are not spies. Emperor Ming said coldly. Hearing this, the atmosphere loosened up. Indeed, as Emperor Ming said, although they had many people here, they were nothing compared to Luo Fan. If Luo Fan discovered their existence, he wouldn't need to make any preparations. He just needed to send a clone over with the chaotic spiritual treasure fragment, and they wouldn't be able to escape. However, they wouldn't be able to question Emperor Ming and the others like they were doing now. Since Luo Fan hadn't appeared yet, it obviously meant that Emperor Ming didn't betray them. The Luo sovereign still didn't know that they were gathered here for a discussion. My apologies. That emperor apologized to the Ming emperor, but it was just a simple apology. Although it was a little rude to suspect Emperor Ming and the others at this time, they were discussing how to deal with the incomparably powerful existence that could completely wipe out all of them with just a clone. No matter how cautious they were, it wouldn't be too much. Not to mention that they were just questioning Emperor Ming and the others. Even if they were to destroy their clones for no reason, it wouldn't be incomprehensible. What about Taoist Tong Huang? At this time, Emperor Guan suddenly asked. Naturally, there were people here who were familiar with Tong Huang, such as Emperor Ming and the others. Tong Huang? He doesn't want to get involved in this matter. Emperor Ming said lightly. He doesn't want to get involved? All the other Emperor Ming's expressions became extremely ugly at this time. This matter was of great importance. Once the slightest bit of it was leaked, all of them would probably die, their souls would scatter, and even all traces of them would be erased. Under such circumstances, it was self-evident that they should be cautious about this matter. But now, after knowing about this matter, a sovereign realm expert actually said that he wouldn't participate in it and let it go. How much does he know? Emperor Guan said coldly. He doesn't know much, but you should be able to guess it. Emperor Ming said lightly. Since he already knows, he doesn't want to get involved. They won't participate, but we have to take action. Emperor Guan said. For their plan, they either got involved or didn't know anything. If they knew something but didn't get involved, it would be a great hidden danger. They couldn't just sit back and watch. Emperor Ming shook his head and said, I don't know where he is now. Ever since I asked him about it, he just refused. Soon after, I couldn't find him anymore. It seems he must have decided not to help either side, a supreme emperor said. He sighed. Hearing this, the other supreme emperors all frowned. Can he really stay out of this matter? Emperor Z said lightly. I think everyone knows the relationship between this matter. If he intentionally or unintentionally leaked it, I don't think I need to explain to you what will happen to us. I think we should find Tong Huang first. There's no need to complicate the issue. At this time, Emperor Ju, who had been silent all this time, finally spoke. Emperor Ju and the others were at least one level stronger than the other emperors present. That was their level. In fact, they were already close to level 3 emperors. Compared to ordinary level 3 emperors, they only lacked the last ray of innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. When such a powerful existence opened his mouth, it naturally had the effect of making the final decision. At this moment, all the emperors quieted down. Unless it's an existence like the Luo sovereign, it's absolutely not an easy task to eliminate an emperor, even if we join forces. It's almost impossible to make him disappear without a trace. Finding Tong Huang won't remove the traces at all. On the contrary, It will alert the enemy and let the news leak, attracting Emperor Luo's attention. Emperor Ju explained. The other emperors nodded in agreement. Emperor Ju had already spoken, which meant that Emperor Guan and Emperor Zi had completed their task. It also meant that Emperor Ju had already thought of what to do. Therefore, at this moment, just like the other supreme monarchs, they fell into silence and listened to Zhu Huang's words, occasionally expressing their agreement or doubt. Emperor Ming, are you sure that there's something wrong with the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light? Emperor Zhu asked Emperor Ming. That's right. I'm absolutely sure of this. Before this, we could faintly feel some kind of spying and pressure on us from our clones. No matter what we do, we couldn't relax, and we couldn't have freedom. But not long ago, this feeling had disappeared. Our connection with our doppelgangers has been completely severed. Emperor Ming said directly. Everyone is like this? Emperor Zhu asked again. That's right. After that, we tried to get rid of the restrictions that Emperor Luo placed on us, but there were no changes. Another emperor said. Hearing that both of them confirmed this, Emperor Zhu nodded and said, looking at it now, it's obvious that there's something wrong with Emperor Luo during the process of building the underworld. This problem has put him in an extremely disadvantageous position. This is our chance. You have a better understanding of the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Do you know what's wrong with Emperor Luo? Another supreme emperor asked. Hearing this, Emperor Zhu said plainly, if I knew that the one who obtained the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light and became a level 3 emperor, it would be me and not Emperor Luo. These words caused the supreme emperor to pause for a moment before he continued. Since you don't know what's going on, then what if the problem with the Luo sovereign is only a small one? What if he realizes what's going on once we act? If you're afraid, you don't have to come. Emperor Zhu said coldly. Hearing this, the supreme emperor's expression became extremely ugly. Why is Emperor Zhu like this? Now that we're all on the same boat, we should unite, help each other, and work together. Is there a need to be so overbearing? A supreme monarch by Zhu Huang's side spoke like this. This supreme emperor was the same as Emperor Zhu. He was also a supreme emperor who cultivated in the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light for a long time. His strength wasn't much weaker than Emperor Zhu. Emperor Zhu could not give face to such a supreme emperor. Therefore, he only harumphed indifferently. The supreme sovereign, who had an ugly expression on his face, gradually regained his composure. He had raised these problems before. It was only to make the plan more secure. But it wasn't really because of fear, nor was it because he wanted to retreat. Although Luo Fan didn't do anything to them all these years, he had asked Child Huang to cause them many trouble. Among them, every one of them had been harassed by Child Huang before. Every one of them had failed in some kind of cultivation because of Child Huang. And according to their conversation with Child Huang, from his words, they knew that the reason why Child Huang was targeting them was because of Emperor Luo's order. Because of this, all of them, the supreme emperors, naturally knew what kind of existence Emperor Luo was. After knowing, Emperor Luo didn't let go of what happened in the past. Naturally, their hearts were filled with fear towards Emperor Luo. They were worried that when the time came, he would directly attack them and personally deal with them. This kind of worry, if they didn't have the chance under normal circumstances, they naturally wouldn't have taken the initiative to deal with Emperor Luo. But it was obvious that this wasn't normal. Now, the other party didn't just want to directly control the changes of the entire underworld through the evolution of the entire underworld. Moreover, there seemed to be something wrong with his body. The threat was already countless times greater than before, and it seemed like the time was now suitable for them to take action. Naturally, they would think of joining forces to deal with Luo Fan. The others thought so, and so did this supreme emperor. Because of this, even when Zhu Huang came over to talk to him, he forcefully swallowed his resentment and directly pretended that nothing had happened, standing there quietly. Fellow Taoist, I guess you already have a plan. I wonder if you can say it out loud? A supreme emperor said to Zhu Huang, even if all of us here add up our strength, we still can't compare to Emperor Luo. Zhu Huang didn't speak of a plan, but directly stated a fact. Hearing this, the scene fell silent. There were so many Supreme Emperors present, but not a single one of them refuted this. Obviously, they all admitted this, so if we want to deal with him, it's impossible for us to just rely on ourselves, Zhu Huang said. Could it be that fellow Taoist can invite those level 3 emperors? A Supreme Emperor's eyes lit up as he asked. Level 3 emperors? Zhu Huang sneered. Could it be that you all still don't understand? Those level 3 emperors are probably already able to suppress Emperor Luo. If they could suppress Emperor Luo, they wouldn't be participating in the evolution of the underworld this time. Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. It was obvious that Zhu Huang's words shattered their fantasies. Don't think that those level 3 emperors would abide by the rules. Back then, they agreed to acknowledge Luo Fan, so they wouldn't use underhanded methods to deal with him. In reality, any cultivator, any expert, as long as they could cultivate to an extremely high level, was definitely the kind of existence that despised the rules and was extremely stubborn about their own interests. Level 3 emperors were naturally no exception. If the main body of the evolution of the underworld was an existence that they couldn't deal with, but an existence that was weaker than them, they definitely wouldn't be able to resist the temptation of taking the underworld. Even if one of them could resist the temptation, not all of them could. But now, all the level 3 emperors were abiding by the rules and participating in the evolution of the underworld with Luo Fan, taking a small amount of authority and leaving the most authority to Luo Fan. This was a clear indication of the reality. Luo Fan wasn't any weaker than those level 3 emperors. Then, how do you plan to borrow external power? A Supreme Emperor asked. External power doesn't only come from cultivators. It can also come from other things. Chaos. That's something that can't be resisted by anyone who hasn't become a true sage. Our external power is chaos. Zhu Huang said. When the others heard this, their faces were filled with disappointment. Although that makes sense, how do we borrow the power of chaos to deal with Emperor Luo? A Supreme Emperor asked. That was the main point. What was chaos? These level 3 emperors knew better than anyone else what it was. They knew very well how terrifying the power of the chaos was. Therefore, they understood that using chaos was enough to deal with Luo Fan. However, understanding was one thing, and applying it was another. You knew that using chaos was enough to deal with Luo Fan. But how to use chaos? How to guide the power of chaos? Since ancient times, countless emperors have been born in this world. Every one of them knew that chaos had infinite power, but who among them had succeeded? Zhu Huang smiled faintly, raised his right hand, and opened it. In an instant, an infinite amount of light gathered in his palm and began to roll slowly. Gradually, it changed and finally turned into a mysterious existence. When the other Supreme Emperors saw this scene, they were the first to react. They all had a strange look on their faces. Obviously, they didn't know what it was. But soon, every single Supreme Emperor had a look of shock on their faces. This is primal chaos attraction. A Supreme Emperor next to Zhu Huang said in disbelief. While the Supreme Emperors were discussing how to deal with Luo Fan in the underworld, Gui Shou, who was in his cave abode, had already gained something. In the vast space-time inside the cave abode that had changed, Gui Shou, who was floating high in the sky, let out a soft cry. Then, the power in his body surged and began to communicate with the great path of the underworld. In an instant, the great path underwent an indescribable change. All kinds of indescribable fluctuations seeped out of the great path. It began to penetrate the great path and enter the layer of rules and laws. As the fluctuations seeped in, the layer of rules and laws began to undergo all kinds of subtle changes. Such changes couldn't be described with words. In the midst of the changes, the entire underworld began to change. Gui Shou's cave abode, which was originally in a corner of the underworld, slowly moved toward the sky of the underworld. In a short while, it had moved to the sky and turned into a pitch-black sun. Then, all the creatures that originally appeared in the underworld felt an indescribable attraction. Amid shocking whooshing sounds, they all quickly shot toward the black sun from all over the underworld. Like sharp arrows, they shot into the pitch-black sun. The pitch-black sun didn't reject any of the sharp arrows. More and more creatures, or more accurately, souls, were sucked into it. This scene looked grand beyond imagination. It was like a sky full of sharp arrows shooting toward the sun from the ground. Because of this light, the fog that originally filled the void in the underworld seemed to dissipate slightly. It looked as if the light from the sun had dispelled the fog. Looks like I've already thought of a perfect method. But to what extent can you perfect it? At this moment, Luo Fan, who was above the underworld, smiled and thought to himself. In his eyes, he could see that the laws of the underworld had undergone some mysterious changes. This change caused the space-time in the sky, which was originally Guay, Shou's cave abode, but had now turned into the underworld's sun, to become the transit point for all creatures that entered the underworld. Any soul or soul that wanted to enter the underworld had to first pass through this space-time. In this space-time, after a series of modifications and changes, they could truly step onto the underworld. Similarly, any soul or een soul that wanted to leave the underworld and return to the outside world, or rather, the world of the living, would need to pass through that space and time. They would also need to undergo a transformation in that space and time. If it was done well, it would obviously completely solve the imperfections of the underworld. It would truly make the underworld a place that was beneficial to the world, a place that could allow the world to continue to grow. It would truly allow the reincarnation of the world to truly become the driving force for the world's growth, evolution, and transformation. Of course, this was only a general direction. Whether this could be done, whether the entire underworld could be truly perfected, and whether all the loopholes in the underworld could be eliminated, would depend on how Guay Shou arranged the space-time. If it was done well, then everything would naturally be perfect. If it was not done well, then it might create even bigger loopholes, causing the underworld to become even more imperfect. Chapter 17:12. At this moment, the changes that occurred in the Black Sun were even more intense than the changes that occurred during the formation of the underworld. The entire space-time seemed to be being casually rubbed by an invisible hand. Regardless of whether it was the nomological laws, energy, matter, time, or space, everything was being rubbed by that invisible hand, causing earth-shattering changes. As these changes occurred, the various buildings that originally appeared in this space-time also began to change. All the buildings began to expand, and the various functions that they originally had were adjusted inexplicably during this process. At the same time, the countless souls and ghosts that had surged into the Black Sun from the underworld entered the buildings in batches. Among them, many creatures that were naturally powerful and just began to change. Their connection with the buildings became closer and closer, and they began to obtain all kinds of authority that they could not have before. They gradually became a part of the operations of these buildings. Thank you, heavens. Joyous cries came from these buildings. Soon after, they began to use their authority according to the information they had obtained and began to control these buildings. They began to make all kinds of subtle changes, not only to the buildings themselves, but also to the souls and ghosts that had surged into these buildings. It was obvious that the turtle lifespan had given the souls and spirits the duties necessary to complete the entire underworld. Most of these existences that had been given these duties were originally living in this space-time. They were creatures with natural Tao bodies. After they were given these duties, they became a part of the reincarnation cycle of this world. From then on, they would live as long as the world and shine as brightly as the sun and moon. As long as the world did not perish, they would not perish. As long as the underworld did not perish, they would not perish. This kind of situation was naturally a kind of bad luck for true cultivators, a kind of bad luck that they could not avoid. However, most of the creatures in this country were just ordinary creatures, and the strongest were only immortals. That could not be any better. Although they were restricted by the underworld and could not leave it, they could not obtain true freedom. They could obtain true longevity. However, this was almost eternal life after all. They could transcend reincarnation. compared to this kind of gain, what was being restricted and imprisoned? Although the number of living beings in this space-time was uncountable, numbering in the trillions, it didn't seem like there was a need for so many people to give them their duties. But don't forget how vast the underworld was. Don't forget just how vast was the space-time outside of the underworld. Such a space-time. Billions of living beings were dying in this underworld Earth at every moment. At every moment, there were billions of souls and soul spirits entering the underworld. If he wanted to completely transform these countless souls and spirits, he would have to send them to different places to be reincarnated according to their merits and characteristics. It went without saying that a lot of workers would be needed. Even if there were trillions of living beings, compared to this, it was still quite difficult. As more and more creatures were given various duties in the underworld, the Book of Life and Death and the Judge Brush in Guei Shou's hands began to project projections. He cast his gaze towards the buildings. In the end, it fell into the hands of those beings who held various positions and became a kind of assistance to them. The Book of Life and Death and the Judge Brush were pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures that were more powerful than almost all pseudo-primordial chaos spiritual treasures. They were so powerful that they were almost true primordial chaos spiritual treasures. How could the effects of such existences be limited to one aspect? Naturally, they were almost omnipotent. When the projections of these two magic treasures fell into the hands of different living beings, they would naturally be able to display different effects and uses. At this moment, there were trillions of projections that fell into the hands of countless living beings with duties. They naturally evolved into countless special appearances and obtained the functions that matched the duties they wanted. This allowed the living beings who had different duties to control their own duties to become more powerful. Of course, the projections of these two magic treasures falling into the hands of those living beings did not just strengthen their control over their duties. The more important effect of these magic treasures was to allow these living beings who had obtained duties to be truly recognized by the underworld. They were truly recognized by the world. The original duties that these living beings obtained were given to them by Guei Shou. Although it was also the result of a natural selection of the underworld, it was still Guei Shou after all. Under such circumstances, they were indeed able to control their own duties and complete their work. They could indeed live as long as the world and shine as the sun and the moon. However, after all, they had not been truly recognized by the origin of the world. They had not truly been recognized by the world for their duties. In this case, it would naturally be fine under normal circumstances. Nothing would change. They could still do whatever they wanted and enjoy. However, once things changed, they would be the first to be affected. Those who had lived as long as the world might be rejected by it because they had not been recognized by it. Without anyone else doing anything, they would die because of this rejection. Because of this, Guei Shou gave the projections of the Book of Life and Death and the Judge Brush to them at this moment. The Book of Life and Death and the Judge Brush were born with the birth of the underworld. They were existences that had naturally evolved from the origin of the world, but they could also be equivalent to the representatives of the world's authority. Under such circumstances, giving the projections of these two magic treasures to someone was naturally equivalent to giving the authority of the world to someone. In this way, those living beings who obtained the projections of these magic treasures would naturally be equivalent to obtaining the recognition of the world. It was equivalent to truly engraving their origin in the world. They would truly be able to live as long as the world and shine as the sun and the moon, no matter what changes occurred in the world. Ox head, horse face, black and white impermanence. Ghost soldiers and ghost generals. Luo Fan looked at the various changes in the black sun. Many thoughts flashed through his mind. The changes in the space-time inside the black sun were getting closer and closer to the scene of the netherworld that he had learned from the legends. Among them, there were Yama judges, ox head, horse face, black and white impermanence, and ghost soldiers and ghost generals. One by one, they appeared in the buildings. However, compared to what he knew from the legends. The number of Yama judges within the Black Sun had increased by who knew how many times. In the entire space-time, there were hundreds of millions of Yama Kings alone. Those judges were dozens of times more than the Yama Kings. After that, there were Oxhead, Horseface, Black and White Impermanents, Ghost Soldiers, and Ghost Generals. There were countless more. It could be said that, amidst the endless number of buildings, almost every building had a Yama King. There were more than a dozen judges, and there were also an extremely large number of small minions like Oxhead and Horseface. In other words, in the entire space-time between the countless buildings, each was equivalent to a legendary netherworld. During the process of the space-time changing, the killing and death outside the space-time didn't stop because of this. Instead, it continued at the same speed as before. In other words, during this process, there were still endless souls and spirits being pulled by the laws of the underworld and thrown into the space-time. After these spirits and phantoms entered this space-time, they were guided by the rules and laws and naturally entered the corresponding buildings. They were differentiated and modified by the Black and White Impermanents, Oxhead, Horseface, Infernal Judges, and Yama Kings in those buildings. In the end, they turned into existences that were different from ordinary spirits and phantoms. Through the various mechanisms in those buildings, they were thrown out of the pitch-black sun and into the underworld, starting their ghost lives after death. The nature of each building was different, and their effects were also different. In addition to this kind of transformation of specific souls into the underworld to start their ghost life, there were also various kinds of souls rotating among them. This building would process and modify the souls. Then, through the circulation of laws, they would be sent to other buildings. After going through a new process and modification, they would be rotated again. Finally, when the requirements were met, they would be sent to the underworld in the final building. At first glance, all the creatures that were transformed and sent to the underworld didn't look any different from before. But in reality, their internal structure was completely different. These souls, or rather, ghosts, could not resist the various kinds of information contained in the surrounding Inchi. They could not resist the mysteries that kept accumulating in their bodies. No matter how powerful they were in the past, no matter whether they had learned that kind of information or that kind of abstruse method, they were all the same. It was the same. And these ghosts that entered the underworld weren't completely free. They were also sent to various areas of the underworld and began to work. They began to modify specific areas of the underworld according to the transformation they had done in the Black Sun and began to build the entire underworld. This was a world of difference compared to the previous life where they didn't need to work and only needed to come to the underworld to freely enjoy their ghost life. It could be said that to them, surviving after death was even more difficult than when they were alive. When all these changes were completed, Gui Shou let out a long breath. An indescribable comfort came from the great Tao of the underworld and poured into his body and mind. It gradually made him feel that his relationship with the underworld was becoming closer and closer. The authority he obtained in the underworld was becoming more and more powerful. This is heaven and earth's favor. Gui Shou suddenly understood. This situation was the heaven and earth being happy because of what he had done and naturally gave him all kinds of rewards. This kind of favor was not too much. Soon, everything calmed down. Although he felt that his authority over the underworld had increased, it was no longer as comfortable as before. Realizing this, Gui Shou was enlightened again. This is still not perfect. This underworld still has more room for improvement. When he realized this, he suddenly felt that the road ahead of him was long and arduous. Before this transformation, he thought that the underworld was already perfect. He did not expect that after this earth-shattering transformation, the underworld would become completely different. But he still had this feeling that the underworld was still not truly perfect. Now that he thought about it, he felt that the underworld was still not truly perfect. Now that he thought about it, he blushed a little. With a thought, Gui Shou stepped forward. In a flash, he arrived in front of Luo Fan, who was standing on the underworld and quietly sensing something. He bowed to Luo Fan. He said, I have done the best I can. Please, Master, give me some pointers. Luo Fan looked at him and smiled. You have done well. For now, this underworld will not have any problems. I feel that this underworld has not reached a perfect state. However, I do not know how to do it. I hope that Master will not be stingy with pointers, Gui Shou said. Hearing this, Luo Fan smiled faintly and said, the transformation of the underworld cannot be perfect. It is an endless process. Endless process? Gui Shou's eyes focused. This was a concept he had never thought of. Yes, the underworld is a part of this world. It is a key part of the reincarnation cycle of the world. This underworld's development naturally depends on the world's development. Naturally, it depends on the development of this world. Although this world has existed for billions of trillions of years, it has always been in an imperfect state. However, it had always been in a state of imperfection. It could be said that it was still at the initial stage of development. Now, a new round of development has begun. Therefore, in the long years to come, this world will change at every moment. As the world changes, the underworld naturally needs to change as well. Only then can it be in perfect harmony with the world. The world changes without stopping, and the underworld develops without stopping. Therefore, it can be called endless, Luo Fan said faintly. Gui Shou was suddenly enlightened by his words, and there was an indescribable admiration in his eyes. This situation was actually not hard to see. However, before this, Gui Shou had never thought about it from this perspective. If it was a normal person, they might think that this was nothing and that it just couldn't think of it. In reality, it was actually very strong. He said to Luo Fan, the difference isn't big. The gap between them wasn't big at all, so he might have become arrogant. However, Gui Shou was not a normal person. Instead, it was a level 2 Supreme Emperor. Such an existence's perspective was completely different from a normal person's. At this time, he was able to see the fundamental gap between him and Luo Fan at a glance. Why could Luo Fan see this, but he couldn't? This was not a coincidence, nor was it his oversight. It was the gap in the perspective, the gap in knowledge, and the gap in the level of thinking. It was also because he recognized this gap that Gui Shou felt an indescribable admiration in his heart. I understand. Gui Shou bowed to Luo Fan again and said, it's good that you understand. Next, you need to think carefully and find a way to perfect the underworld according to the situation of the underworld. This process is also a great opportunity for you. It can polish your current realm. Luo Fan said with a smile. Gui Shou was shocked when he heard this. With a slight sense, he discovered that his realm was indeed a little superficial. After thinking about it for a while, he understood that this superficial was because the increase in his realm was not due to his own comprehension. Most of it was due to the gift of heaven and earth, the gift of the underworld. Although this was a true improvement, it also allowed him to truly comprehend the corresponding mysteries. However, compared to the realm that he cultivated bit by bit, there was still some difference after understanding this. Gui Shou was even more grateful to his master. Without his master's guidance, he probably wouldn't have found this hidden danger. At that time, if he wholeheartedly climbed up, this hidden danger might be exposed at any time, and it would be enough to make him pay a huge price. Go! Luo Fan saw his expression and knew that he understood, so he smiled and said. Gui Shou quickly bowed and retreated, returning to the pitch-black sun. Inside the sun, in the cave residence that he had specially prepared for himself, or rather, the palace, he sat down and began to use his authority in the underworld to carefully sense the entire underworld. He understood the various mysteries that the underworld revealed, and he observed the key points of the operation of the underworld. The entire underworld began to quiet down. After Gui Shou left, Luo Fan only smiled faintly. Although the underworld earth was formed in his eyes, there were still many mysteries within it that were worth his time to explore. At this time, he didn't leave the underworld. Instead, he began to walk in the underworld step by step. He carefully sensed the underworld. Through the various hidden phenomena, he searched for the mysteries behind the underworld. At the same time, he also searched for the mysteries of the reincarnation cycle of heaven and earth. During this process, he slowly sorted out the many comprehensions of the connate, inextinguishable spirit light that he had obtained from the World King and the others. This sort of sorting was naturally very different from the comprehension that he had wholeheartedly immersed himself in before. Back then, he had completely relied on the comprehension of the connate, inextinguishable spirit light. Most of it was to absorb these comprehensions. But now, he was comparing the various comprehensions he had gained here with the outside world and comprehending the various profundities. He was comparing them with the various mysteries of the underworld so that he could comprehend other things by analogy. This allowed his comprehension of the connate, inextinguishable spirit light to find some points of agreement and integrate them together. This process was actually using the world as a teacher to comprehend the mysteries. It was a brilliant method. The reason he chose the underworld to comprehend was because the underworld had just formed. Now, everything was moving from an active state to a stable state. After all, this was a world. It was also a perfect world. There were all sorts of mysteries hidden in this world. All sorts of mysteries and principles were deep and incomprehensible. Mysteries and principles that could allow living beings to become true saints. Under normal circumstances, when a world was completely stable, these mysteries and principles were all intertwined. Apart from true saints, it was impossible to separate them, let alone take them out to comprehend and absorb them. It was only at this time that the underworld had just been formed and all the laws and mysteries were extremely active. Only then would there be a bigger gap between the many mysteries and principles, making it easier to separate them. It was also only at this time that Luo Fan could choose the principles and mysteries that he needed to comprehend. Only then could he do what he was doing now and compare these comprehensions with his own comprehension of the connate, inextinguishable spirit light. Of course, the underworld was not a whole world after all. Compared to the complete world, the principles and mysteries contained in the underworld were naturally biased and could not truly contain all the principles and mysteries of this perfect world. If Luo Fan wanted to comprehend the mysteries of this perfect world through the underworld and finally perfect his worldview to the true saint level, it was naturally impossible for him to become a true saint. Even if he had countless years, infinite wisdom, and infinite comprehension ability to perfectly absorb all the principles and mysteries here, he would definitely not be able to do it. However, compared to the comprehension of the connate, inextinguishable spirit light that he had obtained from the World Emperor and the others, the underworld was more than enough. In comparison, what he was worried about was not the fact that the underworld was not a truly perfect world. Instead, he should be worried about his own ability. While Luo Fan was comprehending with the underworld Earthwalker, Gue Shou was comprehending the underworld Earth in the pitch-black sun, and Xing Yi and Yu Ji were cultivating in seclusion in the underworld Earth in order to become monarchs. Time gradually passed. Unknowingly, hundreds of years had passed. On this day, the entire underworld suddenly trembled slightly. The trembling became more and more intense and obvious. In the end, circles of ripples even appeared in the void. It looked like the entire underworld had turned into an ocean that was constantly being shaken by some powerful creature. At this moment, Luo Fan returned to his senses and looked at the source of the trembling. The source was none other than Xing Yi and Yu Ji, who had been cultivating in seclusion in the Nether Earth for hundreds of years. They had absorbed the various gains they had obtained from participating in the evolution of the Nether Earth in order to become supreme emperors. At this moment, a strange light gradually appeared in the place where they were cultivating in seclusion. Chapter 17:13. WXS 52, WXS 520. If you have read this section, please go to the following page. You can also search for the latest chapter on Baidu. Chapter 17:14. In the light, the inexplicable fluctuation became more and more obvious. In the end, after two earth-shattering thunderclaps, two extremely powerful auras began to spread endlessly, almost enveloping the entire underworld. In the midst of these two auras, the inexplicable heaven and earth began to change subtly. Indistinctly, there seemed to be an indescribable power surging down, condensing into various indescribable concepts, and converging into two figures. These two people were naturally Qing, Yi, and Yuji. This appearance showed that after cultivating for so many years, the two of them had converted all the gains they had gained from participating in the evolution of the underworld into their own cultivation realms, allowing them to finally surpass their limits and become supreme emperors. We finally succeeded. This time, the gap between us should be much smaller. A voice came from Qing Yi's mouth. At this moment, Qing Yi and Yuji looked at each other and saw satisfaction in each other's eyes. Obviously, to them, the current gains were already enough to satisfy them. At this moment, Qing Yi's and Yuji's expressions suddenly changed. How was this possible? How did he become so much stronger all of a sudden? Yuji exclaimed in shock. Almost at the same time, the two of them felt that the Gui show in the underworld was actually many times stronger than they remembered. The gap between them and him did not shrink. Instead, it had increased by many times. Normally, there would be such a huge gap between them. It was not that the two of them could not accept it. After all, the Gui show had always been stronger than them. Even when they were competing, the two of them had to work together to barely be on par with the Gui show. It was natural that the Gui show was stronger than them. There was nothing they could not accept. However, that was only normal. It did not mean that it was now. It must be known that the two of them had obtained great benefits and obtained great improvements. At this moment, they were full of themselves and wanted to compete with the Gui show. However, they suddenly realized that the person they wanted to compete with was actually standing at an extremely high height. He was actually observing them from above. It felt like they had suddenly fallen from heaven to hell. How could they accept this? Impossible. Qing Yi said angrily. Nothing is impossible. Both of you are cultivating, and so is he. Isn't it normal for him to improve like this? Luo Fan's voice rang in their ears. Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yuji's expressions stiffened slightly. They could still refute the words of others. However, they could only accept Luo Fan's words. However, even though he accepted it. However, the unwillingness in their hearts still made it impossible for them to remain indifferent. At this time, Gui Shou's figure gradually appeared in front of them and said, "Congratulations. Now that you have enough strength, do you want to take a position in the underworld?" Hearing this, Qing Yi and Yuji shook their heads and said, "No, we don't want to work for you." Gui Shou said, "How can it be considered working under me? The two of you also have authority over the underworld. You could be considered a part of the underworld's master. You've accepted the position, which is equivalent to you joining as a master. Your status is similar to mine. So how can you be considered as subordinates?" How could Qing Yi and Yuji not know about this suggestion that was just another excuse without changing the truth? Immediately, they shook their heads firmly and rejected Gui Shou's suggestion. Seeing that they were so determined, Gui Shou could only sigh. In fact, he invited them here with enough sincerity. One must know that the underworld earth was simply too brilliant. The various details, rules, laws, and grand chaos within it were all complicated to an unimaginable level. Although he had done well before, as time went by, he felt more and more pressure. Under such circumstances, he indeed had the thought of getting Qing Yi and Yuji to join the Netherworld and help him. However, since Qing Yi and Yuji were extremely against it, he naturally did not say anything more. He just sighed and said, "If that's the case, then forget it." At this time, Luo Fan's figure slowly appeared in front of them. He said to Qing Yi and Yuji, "The two of you are now supreme martial emperors, so you can start to cultivate further. Follow me." After saying that, he turned around and left. When Qing Yi and Yuji saw this, they were overjoyed. They immediately snorted at Gui Shou, turned around, and quickly followed Luo Fan. Seeing the three of them leave, Gui Shou sighed helplessly. He bowed at Luo Fan and returned to the pitch-black sun in a flash. He returned to the palace that he had specially prepared for himself and continued the cultivation process that he had been doing for a long time. Luo Fan did not stay in the underworld with Qing, Yi, and Yuji. Instead, he brought them out of the underworld and headed to the palace on the sacred mountain. The underworld had already perfectly overlapped with the entire world. Naturally, they could head to any location in the outside world space-time from any part of the underworld. It was not a problem to directly arrive at the sacred mountain, which was the mountain where Luo Fan's body was located from this originally unspecial location. Almost in the blink of an eye, Luo Fan had already arrived with the two of them. As soon as they stepped into the palace, Luo Fan felt an indescribable sense of comfort. His entire body seemed to have received an indescribable cleansing, and he became extremely relaxed and free. The reason for this feeling was none other than the unique space-time dimension around his main body. It was a perfect fit for Luo Fan's body. It was a space-time dimension that was completely extended from his body and mind. Under this space-time dimension, Luo Fan's faint clone would naturally receive the support of the space-time dimension and be sorted out by it. Naturally, he would feel an indescribable sense of comfort. Unlike Luo Fan, Qing, Yi, and Yu Ji felt an indescribable pressure shrouding them at this moment. Although the pressure wasn't very strong, it was very mysterious and strange. In that instant, they felt as if their life essence was about to be distorted, and they felt as if everything about them was about to change. Everything about them seemed to have been controlled by some indescribable power and was about to transform into a completely new existence, this space-time dimension. It was completely compatible with Luo Fan's space-time dimension. Compared to the space-time dimension that gave birth to the two of them, the conflict between the two of them was naturally greater. It was natural for the two of them to feel an indescribable pressure during this process. At this moment, Luo Fan only said to them, "You can enter the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to cultivate." Hearing this, Qing, Yi, and Yuji's eyes lit up. They felt an indescribable joy and gratitude from the bottom of their hearts. They were now supreme emperors who had gained wisdom for tens of millions of years and had traveled the world for tens of millions of years. Although their knowledge was insignificant compared to Luo Fan's, it was definitely not inferior. They knew very well what kind of existence the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light was. Now, they actually heard that Luo Fan could allow them to cultivate and comprehend the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. How could they not be happy and grateful that they could experience the mysteries of connate, inextinguishable spiritual light? How could they not be happy and grateful that they could experience the mysteries of connate, inextinguishable spiritual light? Immediately, the two of them kowtowed to Luo Fan and said. At this moment, they no longer had any regrets about rejecting the Gui show. Instead, they felt extremely happy and proud. All they thought about was that they were too wise. Fortunately, they rejected the Gui show. Otherwise, how could they have the opportunity to enter the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to cultivate? How could they receive the care of their master? Luo Fan only smiled faintly. With a wave of his hand, the two of them were instantly swept into the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and into the cluster of worlds. The connate, inextinguishable spiritual light was repelling him. Although it did not allow his main body to enter, it also prevented him from sensing the location of his clone and what exactly was happening to his clone. However, for other living beings and other substances to enter, there was no hindrance at all. Just like before, other living beings and other substances were allowed to enter. This was to be expected. Although Luo Fan's clone had resonated with the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and formed a certain degree of fusion, he was only a level 3 emperor after all. Compared to a true saint who could truly refine the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, there was still a huge difference. In this case, even if there were any changes to his body, even if his clone had some indescribable influence during the breakthrough process, causing the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to change, the change would still be limited. At most, it would only affect himself. It would not be able to completely change the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Therefore, it was possible for the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to repel his main body and prevent his main body from coming into contact with the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. However, if he wanted the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light to completely reject all other living beings and substances, it was obviously beyond the limit of what Luo Fan could influence. It was precisely because of this that such a situation occurred at this time. Luo Fan clearly could not come into contact with the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and could not enter it, but he could easily send other cultivators into it. After entering the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, Qing Yi and Yu Ji directly arrived in a void. In front of them, there was a boundless world dotted with light. These worlds, in their eyes, were so messy, yet so mysterious, so unbelievable. It was as if there were endless principles and mysteries hidden in these countless worlds. This is the interior of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Qing Yi opened his mouth and let out a sigh. He suddenly felt extremely satisfied. So this is the interior of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. What should we do now? Yuji looked around curiously and said, "We will enter those worlds. Each of these worlds seems to have endless mysteries. If we can comprehend them, we will definitely be able to obtain countless benefits. Perhaps we will be able to catch up to the Gui show very soon." Qing Yi pointed at the worlds in front of them and said, and hearing that he could catch up with Gui's show, hearing that they could catch up to the Gui show, Yuji nodded firmly. Hearing that they could catch up to the Gui show had almost become their inner demon. Back then, the gap between the two of them and the Gui show was insignificant. As long as they worked together, although they might not be able to defeat the Gui show, it was absolutely not a problem for them to maintain a stalemate. However, as time passed, tens of millions of years had passed. Their strength had increased tremendously, and they were tens of thousands of times stronger than before. However, compared to the Gui show, the gap had actually widened by thousands of times. How could they accept this? At this moment, it could be said that their greatest wish was to surpass the Gui show and regain the status that Luo Fan had in the past. Qing Yi and Yuji looked at each other. Then each turned into a ray of light and quickly dashed toward a certain world in front of them. In the blink of an eye, they had already entered that world. The moment they entered that world, the world naturally condensed the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and quickly shot toward them. Just as mentioned before, although Luo Fan already had a clone that resonated with the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, to a certain extent, he had already fused with it. However, what he changed, most of it was still the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that was related to him. As for the rest, the overall effect of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light was extremely insignificant. The changes that the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light would produce when facing other living beings were naturally the same as before. It would not disappear just because of Luo Fan's will. Therefore, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light that could refine living beings naturally still existed. It could still turn living beings that entered these worlds into puppets controlled by the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light at any time. If it was an ordinary cultivator, after entering this world and encountering the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, they would definitely be overjoyed and absorb it. However, it was obvious that Qing Yi and Yu Ji, who had come here, were not ordinary cultivators. Their admiration for Luo Fan had already penetrated deep into the origin of their lives. It had almost become their true essence. Under such circumstances, they clearly knew that the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light belonged to Luo Fan. Even if they felt that absorbing the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light would begin to refine it, they definitely did not dare to absorb it. Therefore, at this moment, they did not absorb the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light when they faced it. Instead, they had a thought and instantly set up a layer of defense around their bodies. This layer of defense was so tight and mysterious that it directly isolated the innate indestructible spirit light from the danger of being refined by the innate indestructible spirit light. As for the fact that the defense they set up could isolate the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, it was even simpler. After all, the two of them were already supreme emperors. Furthermore, they were supreme emperors who had received guidance from Luo Fan and could almost be considered to have inherited his legacy. Existences like these were definitely not ordinary. It was really not difficult for them to isolate the connate inextinguishable spiritual light from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. What exactly are these? Qing Yi and Yu Ji were shocked as they looked at the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that kept charging at them. These seemed to be the connate inextinguishable spiritual light of this world. Yu Ji suddenly understood and said, "There's a kind of eternal and indestructible aura, and there's a big flaw in this aura. It's only faintly compatible with this world. Looks like this is what this world represents, a part of the innate indestructible essence of the innate inextinguishable spirit light." Qing Yi nodded and agreed with Yu Ji. However, why are these connate inextinguishable spiritual light charging at us? Yu Ji asked doubtfully. Perhaps Master gave them to us. Qing Yi said hesitantly. Impossible, Yu Ji suddenly said resolutely at this moment. Qing Yi frowned and said, why is it impossible? Although she knew that the possibility of this happening was not high, she still had some hope in her heart. At this time, hearing Yu Ji say it so resolutely and decisively, he naturally felt uncomfortable. Hearing this, Yu Ji said, Master style is not like this. He will create a good cultivation environment for us, but he will not give us too much convenience. He will not let us reap benefits without working hard. Qing Yi's heart skipped a beat. The various experiences she had after being enlightened by Luo Fan surfaced in her mind. Everything was in line with Yu Ji's words. That's right. You're right. Giving us these connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights is not Master style, she said. It seems like these connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights are not simple. We have to study them carefully, Yu Ji said. Qing Yi nodded. After the two agreed, they chose a direction to descend. In the blink of an eye, they arrived at a mountain peak that looked quite similar to the sacred mountain in the outside world. He immediately opened up a cave abode, and the two of them went in separately. Currently, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights were still colliding with their defenses around them. It wanted to break through their defenses, touch their bodies, and enter their life force. Under such circumstances, they needed to maintain this defensive layer at all times. It would take twice the effort to cultivate with half the result. Naturally, they had to deal with these connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights first. They had to understand the characteristics of these connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights before they could cultivate and comprehend the next step. They studied in the cave abode for several years. One day, several years later, a cry of surprise came from the cave abode. The exclamation was filled with indescribable joy. This connate, inextinguishable spiritual light has a very strong assimilation effect. If we absorb it into our bodies, our life force will be changed. When that happens, we won't be refining the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light, but the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light will be refining us. Qing, he said. The expression on his face was one of shock and relief. At this moment, Yu Ji's expression was one of extreme joy as he nodded and said, that's right. I've also studied it. Fortunately, we blocked it outside back then. Otherwise, it would have been troublesome. Both Qing Yi and Yu Ji were supreme emperors now. Although he was just an ordinary supreme emperor who had just stepped into this level, he was still a supreme emperor after all. Compared to second and third emperors, he was still a supreme emperor. Their strength, their ability to study, and their ability to comprehend. They had reached an unbelievable level. Although the connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights were of an extremely high quality, the mysteries hidden within were complicated and unfathomable. They had surpassed the two of them by a lot, but they already had the ability to study and sense it through all kinds of methods. It wasn't difficult for them to find out the answer. It seems that the first step of cultivation in this connate, inextinguishable spiritual light is to eliminate the influence of these connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights on us. Otherwise, we won't be able to continue cultivating and comprehending. Qing Yi said to Yuji. Yuji nodded naturally. That was natural, now that he knew the characteristics of this innate, indestructible essence. He could think of a way to eliminate its influence on him and prevent it from assimilating him. That was something that he could do. The two of them pondered and comprehended in this cave residence for several years. In the end, they finally came up with a solution. Their method was different from Luo Fan's, and it was also different from the Broken Emperor's doppelganger. The two of them transformed their bodies and auras according to the nature of the things in this world, so that their bodies and auras became the same as the creatures in this world. This transformation caused their appearances to change slightly, adding a different kind of charm to them. After this transformation, the two of them no longer had the aura of living beings from the outside world. They had already become like living beings that were born and bred in this world. After this transformation, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights that were originally born in the depths of this world naturally dissipated and returned to the depths of this world. Only faint living beings would be targeted by this innate, indestructible essence. Obviously, as long as one's everything was the same as the native living beings of this world, they would naturally be able to eliminate the source of this innate, indestructible essence. It was only natural for such a situation to occur. We've finally succeeded. Qing Yi let out a long sigh as he floated in the cave residence and looked at the connate, inextinguishable spiritual lights dissipating around him. Yuji also showed a look of joy at this moment. Chapter 17:15. With this change, the two of them felt completely different in this world. It was more than 100 times easier for them to comprehend the various wondrous techniques in this world. Then, the two of them began to walk in this world for the first time and began to understand this brand new world that belonged to the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light and contained all sorts of mysteries of the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. They had created more than 30 million worlds, so they naturally had a good understanding of all kinds of worlds. At first glance, the world before them was only similar to one of the worlds they had created. There was nothing special about it. However, when they began to carefully observe it, after carefully comprehending it, they would discover that this world was more mysterious and profound than any of the worlds they had created before. The entire world was filled with all sorts of auras that contained some sort of inextinguishable nature. The various rules and principles in this world also contained traces of principles and mysteries that could touch them. Under such circumstances, the two of them began to gradually immerse themselves in this world. Their cultivation realms, which were a little unstable because they had just become supreme emperors, began to gradually stabilize. Qing Yi and Yuji began to cultivate orderly in the world inside, the connate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Meanwhile, Luo Fan, who was outside, had once again sent his clone into the underworld. In such a short period of time, the underworld was naturally still in a state where it had just been born and was still not stable. It was still in a state where all sorts of inexplicable mysteries were revealed. Naturally, it was a good place for him to comprehend all sorts of mysteries. Under such circumstances, time passed slowly. Unknowingly, another 100 years had passed. On this day, Luo Fan's original body was in the process of cultivating. Suddenly, he felt an inexplicable wave sweep over. This wave was so mystical. Before it swept over his body, it was as if it didn't exist at all. It didn't reveal any traces at all. It was as if it simply appeared out of thin air and wasn't a wave that spread through space-time. What is this? At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. This kind of fluctuation was so mysterious, so inconceivable. After this wave swept over him, he felt an indescribable pressure suddenly acting on his soul. Under this kind of pressure, he even felt that it was difficult to breathe. Although he didn't know where this fluctuation came from, he didn't know. He didn't know what this pressure was, but he knew. Someone was definitely trying to deal with him. With a thought, countless rays of spiritual light surged out from his body, instantly separating the hall from the surrounding space-time. The hall became a completely independent world that had no connection with the outside world. At this moment, although the fluctuation had weakened slightly, it was still there. Similarly, that inexplicable pressure. Similarly, it was only slightly weakened, but it still had an effect on his spirit. At this moment, a grayish existence suddenly came crashing down on him. Luo Fan had seen countless kinds of grayish existences, and he had even created countless of them. However, the grayish existence in front of him was something he had seen before. The most powerful, the most terrifying, and the most chaotic type. In other words, it was the closest state of chaos. As soon as the grayish existence appeared, he felt the independent space-time dimension around him start to shake violently. Faintly, it seemed as if it couldn't hold on any longer and was about to collapse and be completely destroyed. And the source of this change was the terror emitted by the dusky existence. The pressure. This kind of pressure was so strong. It was so shocking that he felt that he couldn't bear it at all. It caused cracks to appear in the space-time dimension around him, forming some sort of indescribable chaos. This space-time dimension was originally constructed according to Luo Fan's physical and mental state. However, the slightest change would result in a huge difference from Luo Fan's situation. It would no longer make Luo Fan feel comfortable, but would instead make him feel extremely uncomfortable. Now, all of a sudden, this space-time dimension couldn't withstand the oppression and crushing of the grayish existence. This naturally made Luo Fan feel an indescribable pain all over his body during this process. He even felt that his soul was suffering from the shock of a world at this time. This is the chaotic state. At this moment, this thought flashed across Luo Fan's mind. In an instant, he had already identified what that grayish existence was. The kind of grayish existence was none other than the true state of chaos. At least, it was within the scope of Luo Fan's understanding. They can actually attract the chaotic state to deal with me. Who is it? Countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Without hesitation, the spiritual light in his body poured into the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure in his universe in the sleeve. Through the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, his spiritual light began to increase crazily. In the end, it condensed into a six-fingered palm that rushed out of the universe in the sleeve. It blasted towards the dusky existence. Boom! An earth-shattering thunderclap sounded. The six-fingered palm and the dusky existence brazenly collided, producing a terrifying shockwave that completely shattered the space-time inside the palace. In the blink of an eye, the independent world that had just formed turned into fine fragments, forming an indescribable smoke that began to surge around Luo Fan's body. At this moment, a terrifying and unparalleled power poured into the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure through an invisible connection. Then, through the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, it directly entered his body. This made Luo Fan feel an indescribable pain surging from all over his body. If it weren't for the fact that his body was really powerful and had formed a preliminary fusion with his worldview, it wouldn't be possible to shatter it with just a powerful force. Instead, it would require an even more mysterious impact on the mysteries or the worldview. At this moment, his body would have collapsed and been destroyed under the terrifying impact. However, not collapsing wasn't a good thing, because he had collapsed. He could still recover at any time, and the pain would also completely disappear because of this collapse. But now he didn't collapse. All the power was naturally received by his body and mind. The resulting pain poured into his mind without reservation, making him feel as if his body had been destroyed thousands of times. The pain erupted in an instant and directly drowned his mind. If it weren't for the fact that Luo Fan's mind had completely fused with his worldview, his endurance was extremely strong. His endurance was extremely strong. Perhaps this pain alone was enough to make his mind go blank. He had completely lost all control of his body and mind. Oh no, that impact is too strong. This thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind. At this moment, the result of the collision was revealed. Countless cracks appeared on the six-fingered palm at this moment. The entire palm looked like it was formed from countless fragments. The scene was tragic to an unimaginable degree. However, the grayish existence wasn't affected at all at this moment. It was still a ball, and it was moving slowly. It seemed to be moving unhurriedly towards Luo Fan's location. The six-fingered palm tried its best to resist, but under the fierce pressure, it kept retreating this appearance. Obviously, the six-fingered palm was in the most disadvantageous position. This was the first time that Luo Fan saw that the six-fingered palm was at a disadvantage in a battle after he was able to condense it, and it seemed that it wasn't just at a disadvantage. Next, the six-fingered palm seemed to completely collapse under the crushing impact and eventually turn into nothingness. Seeing this, Luo Fan was startled. He quickly took the initiative to pour the two different types of lights from his body into the Primordial Epic Spirit Treasure Fragment, allowing more and more of the light from the Primordial Epic Spirit Treasure Fragment to become the source of strength for the six-fingered palm. The cracks on the six-fingered palm constantly healed, and the strength of the six-fingered palm was enhanced. This way, the six-fingered palm will be able to withstand the crushing gray chaos for a longer period of time. The performance of the six-fingered palm made Luo Fan even more convinced of his previous guess. This six-fingered palm was formed from the traces left by an unknown true sage. It was the real method used to refine the primordial epic spiritual treasure. Without a true sage to resist such a method, he was almost invincible. But now, the six-fingered palm seemed so powerless under the suppression of the dusky existence. So much so that Luo Fan had to use such a powerful method to resist it. Luo Fan didn't believe that the dusky existence wasn't in the state of chaos. Who is it? How can he guide the state of chaos to attack me? Luo Fan was extremely shocked. The state of chaos was endless and existed everywhere in this world. It wasn't difficult for existences below the pseudo-sage level to find the state of chaos. However, according to Luo Fan's understanding, only existences like true sages could guide the state of chaos down and let it enter any world. But now, right in front of him, someone had actually used some kind of method that he couldn't understand at all to guide the chaotic state down and directly crush him. This simply subverted his worldview. It even made him feel like his worldview had been shaken. The impact of having his worldview shaken was almost indescribable for Luo Fan. At this moment, he felt an infinite power explode inside his body, causing half of his body to be completely destroyed in an instant. At this moment, Luo Fan reacted and realized that he had made a mistake. He hurriedly guarded his mind and quickly sorted out his worldview so that his worldview could be stabilized in the process. Fortunately, his worldview was something that he had sorted out bit by bit. After countless years of development, it had already perfectly fused with his mind. Therefore, it wasn't difficult for him to sort out this worldview and completely restore its stability. Soon, he completed this process, and his entire worldview became stable and unshakable again. As his worldview stabilized, the half of his body that had exploded began to condense again. In the blink of an eye, it had returned to the state before it exploded. No, it wasn't the state before it exploded, but a state that was stronger, more stable, and more integrated with his worldview than before. The situation of destruction and establishment was still effective even for someone at Luo Fan's level. He had always been working hard to integrate his worldview with his body and mind, but there was still an essential difference between the two. Therefore, the effect hadn't been very great. But now his body had exploded, so he had to use all his spirit to communicate with his worldview. This was natural. This caused his worldview to be deeply engraved in his body. Naturally, as a result, the integration between his worldview and his body became even closer. Therefore, there was such a situation. He was injured, but it allowed his cultivation to take a step forward At this moment, the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure in his sleeve began to tremble slightly. After all, this was only a fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. For things below the true sage level, it was naturally beneficial. But if it encountered a true state of chaos, naturally, it would be a little lacking in strength. Of course, this kind of strength wasn't enough. It was just that its power couldn't resist it. Even if it fell into the state of chaos, it wouldn't be damaged. After all, this fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure was obtained by Luo Fan after it entered this world from the state of chaos. However, its power couldn't be resisted, which was already the greatest misfortune for Luo Fan. At this time, although he was constantly pouring endless spiritual light into the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure, it was constantly being transformed by the fragment and poured into the six-fingered palm. He was trying his best to resist the gray existence, but in the end, he was unable to completely resist it. The cracks on the six-fingered palm were like a saw, suddenly increasing and suddenly decreasing. It was retreating step by step towards where Luo Fan was, constantly pressuring towards Luo Fan under the pressure of the state of chaos. Facing this change, Luo Fan's heart surged with pressure that he hadn't felt for a long time. This state of chaos could even crush the six-fingered palm. If he were to fall into it, what awaited him would definitely be his entire body and mind being crushed. There was absolutely no other possibility. Unless he could make a breakthrough in this short period of time and become a true sage. At this time, countless thoughts flashed in Luo Fan's mind. All kinds of past experiences were constantly circulating in his mind. He was thinking about who had spent so much effort to deal with him. No matter what methods the other party used, they must have paid a great price and paid a great sacrifice. If an existence who wasn't a true sage wanted to trigger the state of chaos and use it to attack the opponent, how could it be possible without sufficient sacrifice and price? It was obvious that there were traces of those who would make countless sacrifices and pay an incalculable price to deal with him. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind. Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and he seemed to have thought of something. Zhu Huang. Such thoughts flashed in his mind, and he couldn't help but smile bitterly. The existence who would pay such a great sacrifice to deal with him could only be those supreme emperors who had fallen out with him after seeing that he had the fragment of the primordial origin spiritual treasure. It seems that the establishment of the underworld has given them too much pressure. Luo Fan sighed inwardly. No matter what, he was a level 3 emperor. His thinking ability and sensing ability were very strong. There was no need to say more. He didn't think in this direction before, but now that he thought in this direction, naturally, nothing could be hidden from him. At this moment, he even guessed that Emperor Ming and the others must have betrayed him. And that Tong Huang, it was very likely that he had betrayed him. Of course, it was more likely that he knew about this plan, but didn't participate in it. He didn't tell him about it either. He just watched from the side and let him fight with the people who had planned this. Are you still not willing to come out? Luo Fan said faintly. At this moment, his voice spread far and wide, directly into the space and time around him. Those emperors who had plotted against him must be hiding nearby. This Luo Fan was absolutely sure of. After all, he wanted to guide the state of chaos. This wasn't an easy thing to do. Even if there were dozens of supreme emperors, it would definitely take a lot of effort and countless preparations to achieve this. Obviously, it was impossible to hide far away and control it from afar. After his words spread, it didn't cause any changes. It was as if there were no living creatures around and no enemies hiding. There was only the state of chaos that naturally pressed towards him. If it was an ordinary person, he would definitely think that his guess was wrong. However, Luo Fan didn't think so. After countless years of improvement, his thinking ability had been strengthened to this level. He had enough confidence in all his judgments. Since he had made the judgment that they would definitely be around him, he would never doubt his judgment now. He would never think that he was wrong. Therefore, he just snorted coldly and said, Taoist Zhu Huang, don't tell me. Do you think I can't think of you? If that's the case, do you still need to go through so much trouble to deal with me? Hearing his words, There was a moment of silence. For a long time. Just now, a voice came into Luo Fan's ears. I didn't expect you to find out the truth so quickly. It's really admirable. The voice was none other than the voice of Emperor Ju. Hearing this voice, Luo Fan's eyes narrowed. He instantly saw through the barriers of time and space and saw more than 20 emperors hiding in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. This barrier was extremely mysterious and profound. Although it was outside the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, it felt closer to the state of chaos than the gap between heaven and earth. These 20 figures were all figures that Luo Fan was familiar with. Among them was Zhu Huang, Huangzi Huang, Ming Huang, and so on. Each and every one of them was familiar to Luo Fan. At this moment, these 20 people were in an indescribable state. Their bodies seemed to be in absolute chaos, but also seemed to have some kind of deep pattern. It was as if there were billions and trillions of changes happening at every moment, but it also seemed to be eternally motionless. It was as if they would maintain a fixed state from the beginning of time until the end of time. This strange state was somewhat similar to the feeling of the state of chaos. At this moment, everyone had their eyes closed and their expressions were extremely calm. Even Zhu Huang, who spoke before, was the same. Looking at their state, Luo Fan frowned. Although he had already seen them, he still couldn't understand them. He didn't know what state they were in and how they guided the state of chaos to attack him. I didn't expect you to be willing to take such a risk for me. I really can't thank you enough. Luo Fan sighed. Although he could not tell what kind of state they were in, nor could he understand how they guided chaos to attack him in this state, he knew that it was their real bodies and not their doppelgangers that were here at this moment. Moreover, given their state, they were definitely in great danger. They were in danger of not being able to recover from this state. For greater safety, it's necessary to take some risks. At this moment, Zhu Huang's voice entered Luo Fan's ears again. Following that, another voice interrupted. There's nothing we can do. The pressure you've put on us is too great. If we allow you to continue developing, we won't be able to act on our own. Who knows, we might even end up like you, Ming Huang, enslaved. This was also a sovereign that Luo Fan was familiar with. It was also a sovereign that he had discussed with back then. As they spoke, none of the 20 or so supreme sovereigns spoke. Every one of them seemed to be the same as before, as if they were constantly changing, but also as if they would remain in a state of eternal immobility even after countless years. Looking at their appearance and listening to their words, Luo Fan only sighed and said, "At this point, it seems like there's no need to explain anything anymore. I'm very impressed by your means. However, if you want my life." Chapter 17:16. Hearing Luo Fan's words, the other side was silent. A battle of tongues was completely meaningless to cultivators at the peak of the Emperor stage like them. Since Luo Fan said that their methods weren't enough, then he would break their methods. They naturally wouldn't say that Luo Fan was bragging. Luo Fan didn't wait for their reply. After he finished speaking, with a thought, the connate inextinguishable spirit light not far away from him suddenly trembled and suddenly expanded. From its original appearance of a ring, it suddenly turned into the appearance of a long river. The ring was just the appearance that Luo Fan had created after he resonated with the connate inextinguishable spirit light and used his ability to control the connate inextinguishable spirit light to change its appearance. This state, which was like a long river without a beginning and without a trace, was the natural appearance of the connate inextinguishable spirit light. At this moment, the connate inextinguishable spirit light changed from a ring to this appearance. For the connate inextinguishable spirit light, it was like an ordinary person who was originally curled up into a ball suddenly relaxed and stood up straight. This naturally didn't require any power from Luo Fan. In fact, he didn't even need to expend any power. He only needed a thought, and the connate inextinguishable spirit light would naturally change. Moreover, because the connate inextinguishable spirit light originally looked like a long river and not a ring, Luo Fan didn't need to have any connection with the connate inextinguishable spirit light at this moment. Even if there was an indescribable barrier between him and the innate inextinguishable spirit light, making it impossible for him to enter and control the innate inextinguishable spirit light, he could still use some mysterious connection to affect the traces he had left behind in the innate inextinguishable spirit light, naturally eliminating the changes he had made to the innate inextinguishable spirit light, thus turning it into what it was now. The connate inextinguishable spirit light originally looked like a small ring. The range of its influence, but was only a small ball. Now that it had suddenly turned into a long river, it was tens of thousands of times larger. In an instant, it shot out and brazenly collided with the six-fingered palm that Luo Fan had sent out with the primordial essence spirit treasure fragment, as well as the six-fingered palm that was constantly colliding with it. The chaotic state that was constantly crushing each other. Puff! With this soft sound, the six-fingered palm shattered with a loud bang. It turned into boundless energy and began to rapidly construct a vast space-time around the river. This space-time looked like the void of the universe. He was surrounded by boundless darkness. Amidst the darkness, the long river formed by the inextinguishable connate spirit light. Like the Milky Way in the starry sky, it traversed the void, causing the hall, which had been in chaos and seemed to have fallen into an apocalyptic scene, to turn into a dazzling and grand starry sky in the blink of an eye. The six-fingered palm had already withstood the terrifying impact of the primal chaos state, and under the impact, it was already filled with countless cracks. At this time, under the impact of the connate inextinguishable spirit light, it was natural for it to have such a reaction. As for the shattered energy that formed this space-time, that wasn't surprising at all. The nature of the power that had been enhanced by the primordial essence spirit treasure fragment was already extremely high. Even if it was shattered, it couldn't completely disappear. It wasn't surprising that it formed a world according to the nature of its power. Even the six-fingered palm that Luo Fan had created with his own power had suffered such damage. The chaotic state that was opposing Luo Fan naturally wasn't much better at this moment. In that instant, the primal chaos state and the innate inextinguishable spiritual light clashed, and an endless radiance burst out between the two. Within the light, there were endless space-time and endless heaven and earth that were frantically being born. These space-time and heaven and earth were extremely mysterious and chaotic. Among the endless space-time, only a very small number of space-time could exist stably. Almost all of the remaining space-time were born in an extremely unstable state. They didn't need any other power to naturally develop towards the abyss of complete destruction. However, even the very small number of space-time that could exist stably didn't remain for long. That was because at this moment, the impact produced by the connate inextinguishable spirit light and the chaotic state was constantly leaking out. Earth-shattering destructive power erupted from the impact, directly destroying everything in the surroundings. The surrounding worlds that were created by the impact were constantly being destroyed, turning into more and more world fragments. In the end, they completely disintegrated and fused with the surrounding starry sky, as if they were part of the starry sky to begin with. A portion. During this process, the connate inextinguishable spirit light constantly trembled. Ripples constantly appeared from the impact point and constantly radiated in all directions. Along with the impact, Luo Fan had an inexplicable feeling, as if an indescribable connection was slowly being established between him and the connate inextinguishable spirit light. Of course, this connection was extremely slow and extremely weak. If he wasn't careful, he might have completely overlooked it. When he discovered this, Luo Fan's eyes lit up. Although he couldn't really find out where this connection came from, he had an extremely firm guess. This connection must have come from his clone. It must have come from his clone that was currently cultivating in the connate inextinguishable spirit light, or rather, his clone that was unknowingly disconnected from him. As for why this happened, he didn't know. However, he thought about it. It was nothing more than the connate inextinguishable spirit light being impacted and becoming a little chaotic. This caused some problems to appear in the mechanism that originally restricted or disconnected him from his clone. To him, this situation could be considered as a pleasant surprise. The connate inextinguishable spirit light suffered such a huge impact and underwent such an intense change, so the changes to the chaotic state would obviously be even more intense. At this moment, during the collision, strands of primal chaos started to crumble under the impact. They were constantly evolving into space-time, worlds after worlds. Those worlds were constantly collapsing and dying during this process. From the looks of it, it was clear that the chaotic state was constantly collapsing and dying during this process. Although the speed of the collapsing and dying was extremely slow, it was collapsing and dying after all. In this situation, Luo Fan had already expected this. However, Zhu Huang and the others, who were hiding outside the gap between the chaotic state and the heaven and earth, each emitted an incredible aura. It should be known that they had already paid a huge price to guide the chaotic state into this world. They had even risked the possibility of their lives perishing. Under such circumstances, how much confidence did they have in the chaotic state? It was self-evident. However, right now, in front of them, the chaotic state was already unable to withstand the opponent's simple means. It was actually being destroyed bit by bit during the impact. This had simply subverted their worldview. How is this possible? The chaotic state is invincible. If it's not a true saint, how could it be destroyed? Zhu Huang's voice came from the group of over 20 emperors. Don't say it's impossible. It has already happened. What should we do? Obviously, the other emperor was more rational. He shouted at this moment. Zhu Huang didn't care about these words. He just kept muttering, "This is impossible. This is impossible. Calm down." At this moment, a cold voice came from the group of supreme emperors. This cold voice was like ice, causing the surrounding space-time to completely freeze, causing the over 20 supreme emperors to be sealed in ice in the blink of an eye. Under this change, all of the emperors suddenly came to their senses. Zhu Huang instantly stopped murmuring. "That's right, we should calm down now. We still have a chance." Zhu Huang, who had regained his composure, said. As he spoke, the surrounding ice that had completely sealed them cracked and shattered. The shattered ice rapidly dissipated, directly merging with the space-time. Soon, it was as if it had never existed. At this moment, in the center of the over 20 supreme emperors, a strange and hazy existence suddenly appeared. This strange existence exuded an extremely chaotic aura. It seemed to contain everything in the universe, yet also seemed like nothing existed. It gave off a feeling of eternity and indestructibility, as well as a feeling that it could be destroyed at any moment. This was the item that Zhu Huang had taken out back then. The Seed of Chaos. As the Seed of Chaos appeared, the distance between the over 20 supreme emperors and the chaotic state was shortened. Immediately after, the Seed of Chaos began to expand like a balloon. As it expanded, an indescribable pressure began to emanate from the Seed of Chaos. Under the pressure, the figures of the Zhu Huang and the other supreme emperors became more and more illusory, as if they were about to turn into nothingness and disappear from the universe. Immediately after, an earth-shattering explosion was heard. Following this explosion, a chaotic state suddenly surged out from the seed of primal chaos. As a chaotic state, it naturally did not have to cross space-time to reach a certain place like everything else in the world. As soon as it was born, it naturally appeared not far away from Luo Fan and brazenly joined the chaotic state that had a powerful impact with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Not only did it completely replenish the strands of chaotic state that it had lost, but it even directly doubled the chaotic state. At this moment, the impact force of the chaotic state had increased by a lot. Or rather, it could not be said to be an impact force, but a kind of impact concept. Under this impact concept, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light trembled and actually began to shrink. A pit appeared on the surface of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. With the appearance of this pit, the ripples on the surface of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light became more and more intense, simply forming waves. At this moment, the entire connate inextinguishable spiritual light felt like it had been thrown into a washing machine, and a force started to twist it continuously. How can this be? At this moment, the one who exclaimed was no longer Zhu Huang and the others, but Luo Fan. At this moment, he looked like this. It was clear that the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was somewhat unable to withstand the impact of the chaotic state. Its integrity, its eternal and indestructible characteristics had already been shaken. However, this situation should not have happened. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light was originally born in the chaotic state, and it was originally an existence that could not be shaken or destroyed by the chaotic state. How could it not be able to withstand the chaotic state? At this moment, countless thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind. All sorts of speculations kept appearing in his mind. The connate inextinguishable spiritual light was born in the chaotic state. There was no doubt about this. There was also no doubt that such a connate inextinguishable spiritual light could not be destroyed in the chaotic state. However, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light before him had such a change in the chaotic state, and it seemed like it was about to be penetrated. There was no doubt about this fact either. Then, this represented a very obvious fact. That was, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light before him was different from the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was born in the chaotic state. Could it be? This is not the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Such a thought suddenly flashed through his mind. However, very soon, Luo Fan had already understood what was going on. This is still the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, but it is no longer the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that was born in the chaotic state. It has already become the connate inextinguishable spiritual light that has evolved after entering this world. It is completely different from when it was in the chaotic state. Thinking of this, he slightly let out a sigh of relief. As long as this was still the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, it would have quite a big advantage over the chaotic state. The reason why it could not withstand it now was because the evolution of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had not reached perfection. As such, perhaps the connate inextinguishable spiritual light would show all sorts of unprecedented changes under the impact of the chaotic state, and it might even look like it would be slightly damaged. However, it would definitely not be destroyed. This might even be the opportunity of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, an opportunity that had truly evolved to perfection. Just as these thoughts flashed through his mind, an inexplicable change occurred. All of a sudden, all sorts of inexplicable powers began to rapidly gather somewhere within the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. In the blink of an eye, a figure appeared in the void between the endless worlds. It was another Luo Fan. The moment Luo Fan appeared, endless mysteries began to surge into his heart frantically. Then, through his soul, they were directly transmitted to where Luo Fan's main body was. These mysteries were none other than the mysteries of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. I've finally broken through. At this moment, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. Everything that happened at this moment was clearly because Luo Fan's clone had successfully broken through and stepped from the 5-realm false sage level to the 6-realm false sage level. The inextinguishable spirit light was crazily pouring into his soul from the inextinguishable spirit light. After his body broke through to the next level, the inextinguishable spirit light naturally poured into his soul after the fusion between his body and the inextinguishable spirit light had greatly increased. The entire process was as if Luo Fan's physical body had become a gap in the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, allowing the connate inextinguishable spiritual light to naturally flow its mysteries into his body in order to fill the gap. This is the 6th realm false sage. Luo Fan's clone let out a long sigh. At this moment, while he felt endless mysteries pouring into his soul, he also felt that his connection with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had become closer and closer. His control over the connate inextinguishable spiritual light had become more and more arbitrary. With a thought, the long river formed by the connate inextinguishable spirit light wriggled on its own. With a slight tremble, it formed a sphere and brazenly enveloped the chaotic state of the connate inextinguishable spirit light, which had already created a crater in the connate inextinguishable spirit light. When this change occurred, the space-time that seemed like it could collapse at any time instantly stabilized. The strong sense of crisis that had been affecting Luo Fan's soul previously had completely disappeared. How is this possible? At this moment, Zhu Huang roared in shock again. Originally, they had dared to make a move because there was a problem with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, and they thought that Luo Fan couldn't control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. In the current situation, whoever dared to say that Luo Fan couldn't control the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was a fool. How could he not be shocked? How could he not be shocked? Oh no, I can feel my doppelganger again. At this moment, Ming Huang suddenly cried out in shock. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled slightly. His clone made a grabbing motion inside the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, and the clones of Ming Huang and the others, who had been sealed in the depths of the connate inextinguishable spiritual light, broke the seal in an instant and appeared in front of him. The clones of Ming Huang and the others had been completely refined by the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Everything that Luo Fan did to them was the same as what the connate inextinguishable spiritual light did to them. Therefore, even though they had been forcibly sealed by Luo Fan for so many years, none of them hated Luo Fan. None of them had any negative feelings towards Luo Fan because of this. At this moment, these clones were still extremely respectful towards Luo Fan. Luo Fan looked at them and said faintly, "Destroy your true bodies." At this moment, the connate inextinguishable spiritual light was constantly vibrating. The endless world seemed so chaotic during this process, as though there was a stick sticking in and stirring the world like a pot of porridge. This was the result of the chaotic state constantly colliding with the connate inextinguishable spiritual light. Such a huge movement. It was as though he was setting up the atmosphere for Luo Fan's words. This caused his originally ordinary words to be filled with boundless murderous intent. When Zhu Huang and the others heard this voice, they were all secretly shocked. Of course, they were only shocked in their hearts. At this moment, they were unable to control their bodies. Their faces and figures were still the same as before. They did not move at all and did not change at all. Yes. At this moment, the 8 clones in front of Luo Fan's clone bowed and responded. Following this, they closed their eyes. Immediately after, an indescribable wave was emitted from their bodies and began to travel through some mysterious connection toward a certain place in the void. Although Emperor Ming and the rest were in an indescribable state, the connection between their true bodies and their doppelgangers was a mysterious connection that could penetrate through the perfect heaven and earth. Other than the means of a true sage, even if they were in such a state, they would not be able to cut off this connection. Obviously, the technique that they were using now wasn't a true sage technique. Therefore, although it was a little difficult, Emperor Ming and the others still managed to inject the indescribable wave into their bodies. The moment this wave entered their bodies, it quickly rushed towards their origin of life. At this moment, all sorts of indescribable fear emerged in the hearts of Emperor Ming and the others. "Stop! Stop!" Emperor Ming and the others shouted in panic. At this moment, all of their energy was focused on the chaotic seed, trying their best to guide and control the chaotic state. Even though they clearly felt that the wave was rushing towards their origin of life, and knew that if the wave entered their origin of life, there would be extremely serious consequences, they could only watch helplessly. They simply couldn't take any effective measures to resist the wave. At this moment, the chaotic seed suddenly trembled inexplicably. Vaguely, there were actually signs of instability. As the primal chaos seed showed signs of instability, within the range of Luo Fan's innate, inextinguishable spirit light, the primal chaos also showed signs of instability. Its originally chaotic transformation actually faintly revealed some kind of inexplicable order, as if it was about to evolve into something that Luo Fan could understand. During this change, Luo Fan felt that the impact on the innate, inextinguishable spirit light had suddenly weakened a little. The terrifying power that originally caused the countless worlds within the inextinguishable spiritual light to become chaotic seemed to have shrunk at this moment.